What if wars were decided not only on battlefields, but also in banking houses, in commercial letters, in secret payment channels, and on the stock exchanges of Europe? If not only generals, kings, and emperors determined the outcome of major conflicts, but also those people who moved the money that fed armies, paid soldiers, and kept entire states alive? That's exactly what this script is about. We look at the Rothschild family, one of the most famous banking families in history. To this day, her name stands for wealth, influence, and international financial power. But it is precisely this family that is the subject of countless stories, legends, and conspiracy myths. Some see it as an invisible force behind Europe's wars. Others see it more soberly as exceptionally successful financial actors at a time when war without credit was hardly possible. But where does verifiable history end, and where does the myth begin? What role did the Rothschilds really play in the Napoleonic Wars, government bonds, gold transports, and the financing of European powers? And why did a real banking dynasty become a symbol of secret power, mistrust, and political propaganda? Before we start, write me your opinion in the comments. Do you think that money and banks influence wars more than kings, generals, and ideologies? Or are finances just a tool, while the actual decisions are made elsewhere? Write your answer below in the comments, because this is exactly the question that accompanies us through the entire topic. And if you are interested in historical backgrounds, power politics, wars, strategies, and the hidden connections behind major events, then feel free to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss any more videos about history, power, and the decisions that have shaped our world. Now we begin with the rise of a family from Frankfurt, whose name would soon be known in London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and at the courts of Europe. A story about money, war, trust, rumors, and the dangerous power of narratives. Chapter 1. The Red Sign of Frankfurt. If you want to understand the history of the Rothschild family, you don't have to start in a palace, not in a ministry, and not even on a battlefield. You have to walk into a narrow alley in Frankfurt am Main, into a world of densely packed houses, strict rules, mistrust, trade, faith, poverty, and the will to survive. There, in Frankfurt's Judengasse, the rise of a family began, whose name would later become known throughout Europe. The Rothschilds were not powerful from the beginning. They were not born into a world that was open to them. On the contrary, they lived in a society that granted Jewish families only limited rights, restricted their freedom of movement, and closed off many professions to them. This is precisely why their rise is so remarkable, because it did not arise from military force or political domination, but from trade, trust, accuracy, patience, and an extraordinary sense of the mechanisms of power. Frankfurt's Judengasse was a place of boundaries for centuries. Jewish families had to live there. Their numbers were regulated, their rights depended on the goodwill of the authorities, and even economic success did not offer any secure protection against exclusion. The houses were narrow, often overcrowded, and life was characterized by regulations, taxes, and social insecurity. But within these narrow boundaries, a remarkable culture of trade and education developed. Because many traditional professions and offices were closed, Jewish traders often concentrated on activities that were allowed to them or in which they could develop advantages through experience and networks. This included trading in goods, coins, bills of exchange, antiques, precious metals, and later also financial transactions. In a world where states, princes, and merchants were in constant need of money, such skills could be of great importance. The name Rothschild goes back to a house sign. At a time when many houses did not have modern numbers, they were recognized by signs. The house with the red shield became the family's namesake. This simple sign later gave rise to a name that was associated with banking, state finances, and international power in Europe. But before it became a myth, it was initially only an indication of origin. It was a sign in a narrow street, a piece of identity in a world where family history often depended on houses, symbols, and professional traditions. At the center of the early rise was Mayor Amschel Rothschild, born in Frankfurt in 1744. He grew up in an environment where economic skill was not just a way to move up, but often a matter of survival. Early on, He came into contact with coins, trade, and financial transactions. His preoccupation with rare coins and historical valuables became particularly important. This sounds inconspicuous at first, but it was precisely this area that opened doors to a world that remained closed to many others. Princes, aristocrats, and wealthy collectors were interested in coins, metals, and antiques. Those who were able to procure rare pieces for them not only gained money, but also access, trust, and contacts. Mayor Amschel understood that trust in trade could be more valuable than any single win. Anyone who worked with money, coins, and later with loans had to be reliable. A mistake, a broken promise, or a lost order could destroy the reputation. In a society in which Jewish traders were already under special scrutiny, reliability was crucial. Rothschild built his reputation with great care. He delivered what he promised. He cultivated relationships. He thought long-term. These characteristics became the basis of a family business that would later serve states and courts. A decisive contact was the relationship with the House of Hesse-Kassel, especially with William of Hesse-Kassel, one of the richest princes of his time. The Hessian ruling house had considerable funds at its disposal, including the rental of soldiers to other powers, especially Great Britain during the American Revolutionary War. From today's perspective, this practice was morally difficult to bear, but in the 18th century it was part of European power politics. Small and medium-sized principalities were able to generate revenue from their armies, while great powers received additional troops. For financiers, this meant that payments had to be processed, assets managed, and international money flows organized. Mayor Amschel Rothschild increasingly moved in this environment. His success was not simply the result of a single moment of genius. It was based on a mindset. Mayor Amschel recognized that money was not only possession, but movement. Capital had to move from one place to another. Debts had to be serviced, bills of exchange cashed, goods paid for, and political obligations fulfilled. The more restless Europe became, the more important people became who could organize such movements. A banker was not just someone who stored money. He was a mediator between places, rulers, merchants, and risks. He had to know who could be trusted, which news was reliable, which currency remained stable, and which state was on the verge of trouble. This ability became increasingly valuable at a time when Europe was heading for major upheavals. The 18th century was marked by dynastic wars, colonial conflicts, courtly luxury, growing national debt, and an increasingly intertwined world of trade. Princes needed money for armies, courts, and administration. Merchants needed loans for goods. States had to structure their debts. The world of finance became more complex, and those who understood it could gain influence even without holding political office themselves. But the rise of the Rothschilds must not be romanticized. It happened in a harsh world. The family continued to live with discrimination, legal uncertainty, and social rejection. Even economic success did not immediately remove the barriers. Jewish families often had to buy privileges or secure them through special services. Their status could change with political moods. A change of ruler, a crisis, or a war could open up opportunities, but also bring dangers. This is precisely why caution was a central part of the Rothschild strategy. You had to grow without becoming unnecessarily visible. You had to cultivate connections without being completely dependent on a single patron. You had to appear loyal and at the same time remain flexible. One of Mayor Amschel's most important decisions was the involvement of his sons in the business. He was not only thinking of a local business, but of a family network. His 5 sons were later to work in various European centers: Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. This distribution was of enormous importance. It created a system in which information, capital, and decisions within the family could be coordinated across national borders. In an era without telephones, electronic transfers, and modern news outlets, a trusted family network was an invaluable asset. Brothers could write to each other, warn each other, counsel each other, and carry out assignments. Trust did not have to be rebuilt in every business, because it was supported by family, common interests, and common origins. This is a core of the later Rothschild power. It was not based on magic, not on secret world domination, and not on the control of all events. It was based on information advantage, international presence, capital strength, discretion, and a dense network of personal relationships. In the past, those who knew that a state needed money, that an army was on the way, that a government remained solvent, or that a political alliance was faltering could make better decisions. In the age of war, information was almost as valuable as gold. At the same time, the material for later legends was created early on. For many contemporaries, a Jewish family from Frankfurt that traded with princes, built up international connections, and rose in state finances did not fit into the old image of social order. Success that did not come from nobility, land ownership, or military rank seemed suspicious. Financial power was difficult to see and therefore easy to mystify. You didn't see an army, no crown, no territory, but you felt influence. It was precisely this that gave rise to mistrust and later dangerous narratives. Anyone who did not understand or did not want to understand the mechanisms of credit, exchange trading, and government bonds could easily interpret them as secret manipulation. But in the beginning, there was no mysterious plan to dominate Europe. In the beginning, there was a family that lived in a narrow, legally limited world and had to use every opportunity to achieve safety and advancement. Mayor Amschel Rothschild combined commercial discipline with social instinct. He knew that power does not always appear loudly. Sometimes it begins in account books, in letters, in discreet conversations, and in the ability to be solvent at the right time. When Mayor Amschel died in 1812, he had laid the foundations. A Frankfurt trading house had become a family business that was ready to penetrate the major financial centers of Europe. His sons were to continue the work and act in an era marked by revolution, Napoleon, war, and reorganization. Europe was in flames, and states needed money on a scale that previous generations had hardly known. It was precisely at this moment that the Rothschild network became a factor in history. Not because it created wars, but because it understood that war could not be waged without money. Chapter 2. Europe before the storm. Before the Rothschild family became a name associated with government bonds, war financing, and political influence, Europe was already in a state of deep tension. At first glance, the continent in the 18th century still looked like a world of the old order. Kings ruled over empires, princes ruled their territories, nobles occupied the highest offices, and most people lived within fixed social boundaries from which only a few could escape. But beneath this seemingly stable surface, Europe was changing rapidly. The states became larger, their administrations more complex, their armies more expensive, and their political goals more ambitious. War was no longer just a matter of fighting spirit, dynastic ambition, and military tactics. War increasingly became a question of financing. The great powers of Europe were in constant competition for influence, trade, colonies, sea routes, and territorial security. Great Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Spain watched each other with suspicion. Alliances were formed and broken again, borders were shifted, inheritance claims were asserted, and trade interests were defended with military force. The continent was not a peaceful area that was suddenly thrown out of balance by the French Revolution. Long before that, Europe had experienced major wars at regular intervals: the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, and numerous smaller conflicts. Each of these wars showed more clearly that power did not depend solely on how many soldiers a ruler could field. It was also crucial whether he could equip them, pay them, feed them, and keep them in the field for years. The 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763 in particular had made the European powers aware of how expensive modern warfare had become. Prussia under Frederick the Great fought against a superior force of Austria, Russia, France, and other opponents. At the same time, Great Britain waged a global war against France, which took place not only in Europe, but also in North America, India, the Caribbean, and on the world's oceans. War was thus no longer just a European event. It had become global. It connected colonies, trading companies, fleets, fortresses, financial markets, and diplomatic networks. Those who fought in Canada had to pay in London. Anyone who wanted to gain influence in India needed ships, soldiers, and loans. Anyone who moved armies in Central Europe had to buy grain, procure horses, manufacture cannons, and pay wages. This development fundamentally changed the relationship between the state and money. Princes and governments could no longer rely solely on their current revenues. Taxes, customs duties, and domain revenues were often not enough to finance long wars. That is why states are increasingly resorting to loans. They borrowed money from bankers, issued bonds, or got into debt with merchants and financial institutions. This created a close connection between political power and creditworthiness. A state that was trusted could borrow money more easily. A state that was considered insecure had to pay higher interest rates or could hardly find any investors. Trust thus became a political resource. In this world, private bankers gained special importance. They were not rulers, generals, or ministers, but they were at a sensitive point in the system. They were able to organize payments, issue bills of exchange, procure coins, manage assets, and establish contacts between courts, merchants, and investors. At a time when there were no central banks in the modern sense, no electronic transfer, no fast communication, and no single European financial markets, such skills were crucial. Money had to be moved physically or via bills of exchange. Currencies differed from country to country. Coins had different weights, purities, and values. Political crises could shake the value of a debt security. An experienced financier had to be able to assess these uncertainties. At the same time, 18th century Europe was an area of great social contrasts. While the farms were in splendor, many farmers and city dwellers lived under heavy strain. Taxes, levies, crop failures, and rising prices could quickly lead to unrest. The nobility claimed privileges, the church had great influence, and most political systems gave the population little say. But new ideas spread. The Enlightenment called old authorities into question. Philosophers discussed reason, natural law, freedom, property, religious tolerance, and the legitimacy of state violence. In salons, universities, lodges, and printed publications, an intellectual climate arose that challenged the foundations of the old order. The Enlightenment should not be understood as a simple movement against monarchy and religion. Many rulers resorted to enlightened ideas to make their states more efficient. They reformed administrations, promoted education, reorganized the tax system, or strengthened the central power. But it was precisely these reforms that showed how much the modern state was changing. He wanted to know more, control more, earn more, and achieve more. He needed officials, statistics, maps, archives, schools, armies, and financial systems. Power became more bureaucratic. And the more bureaucratic power became, the more dependent it became on money. For Jewish families like the Rothschilds, this world was contradictory. On the one hand, they were legally disadvantaged, socially excluded, and often tied to certain places of residence or professions. On the other hand, the very activities that were open to them could gain in importance in the new financial world. Trade, coinage, credit brokerage, and international contacts offered opportunities that were hardly foreseen in traditional power structures. The old order closed many doors, but the growing money economy opened up some narrow entrances. Those who were able to take advantage of them won chances, even if these chances remained uncertain and dangerous. Frankfurt am Main played a special role in this context. The city was an important trading center, trade fair location, and financial hub in the Holy Roman Empire. This empire was not a centralized nation-state, but a multi-layered structure of principalities, imperial cities, ecclesiastical territories, knighthoods, and the Habsburg Empire. This political fragmentation made Germany complicated, but it also opened up opportunities. Where there were many small and medium-sized lordships, there were many farms, many cash registers, many coinage systems, and many financial needs. For traders and bankers, this meant work, risk, and opportunity at the same time. The rulers of this time lived in a constant tension between prestige and solvency. A prince wanted to lead a brilliant court life, build a castle, pay officials, maintain diplomatic envoys, and provide troops in an emergency. But his income was limited. When war broke out, the financial problems immediately increased. Soldiers had to be recruited, uniforms procured, magazines filled, weapons produced, and allies supported. Even a successful campaign could exhaust a state financially. Defeats were even more dangerous, because they destroyed not only armies, but also creditworthiness. Therefore, the 18th century was a time in which politics and finance merged more and more closely. A minister had to know not only which army was strong, but also which treasury remained resilient. A diplomat not only had to negotiate alliances, but also assess whether an ally could pay for his obligations. A banker, on the other hand, had to understand political developments, because a war, a change of throne, or a revolution could make the difference between profit and loss. Money was not neutral. It moved to where security, returns, and political protection were expected. In this situation, the importance of information grew. News about troop movements, peace negotiations, state finances, crop yields, or political unrest could be economically decisive. Anyone who knew earlier that a war was imminent could protect themselves. Anyone who learned that a state could become insolvent could reduce their claims. Those who had reliable messengers, correspondents, and relatives in different cities had an advantage. It was precisely this connection that would later become important for the Rothschilds. Their strength lay not only in capital, but also in their ability to collect, audit, and use information faster than many competitors. At the same time, Europe was approaching a crisis that hardly anyone foresaw in its full scope. France, for a long time one of the most powerful monarchies on the continent, was financially heavily burdened. Wars, farm expenses, an unfair tax system, and political blockades had brought the state to the brink of insolvency. The support of American independence against Great Britain had brought France foreign policy glory, but further increased the debt. When the Crown tried to push through reforms, it met with resistance from privileged groups. A financial crisis turned into a state crisis into a revolution. For the old powers of Europe, the French Revolution was a shock. It called into question not only a king, but the entire principle of monarchical legitimacy. If a people could challenge its government, if privileges were abolished, property systems were changed, and new political rights were demanded, then this threatened the foundations of the old order. Soon, domestic revolution and foreign policy war were combined. France was fighting monarchies were fighting revolutionary ideas, and Europe was entering an era in which war, ideology, and mass mobilization were taking on a new form. For financial institutions like the Rothschilds, this period meant enormous risks, but also great opportunities. Wars destroyed trust, blocked trade routes, and endangered assets. But at the same time, they created a huge demand for money, gold, loans, bills of exchange, and payment services. States that were fighting for their survival needed financial actors who were reliable, discreet, and capable of acting internationally. It was at this point that the historical space began to open up in which the Rothschilds were able to make their extraordinary rise. So Europe before the storm was not a quiet world that suddenly exploded out of nowhere. It was an order full of contradictions. Monarchies demanded obedience, but needed credit. Nobles defended privileges, while bourgeois and financial elites gained in importance. States waged wars in the name of honor, dynasty, and balance of power, but had to pay for these wars with debt. Ideas of freedom and reason spread, while millions of people remained politically excluded. In this tense world, money became an invisible force in history. It did not decide on war and peace alone, but without money, neither war nor peace could be shaped. When the revolution broke out in France and Napoleon led Europe into a new phase of violence a little later, the foundation had already been laid. The old states were powerful, but vulnerable. Their armies were large, but expensive. Their policies were ambitious, but dependent on credit. And it was precisely in this combination of power, war, and financial hardship that the Rothschild family began to play the role that would make their name famous, admired, and at the same time the target of countless rumors. Chapter 3. Mayor Amschel and his 5 sons. The rise of the Rothschild family was not based solely on the talent of one man, but on an idea that was extraordinarily effective for its time. Mayor Amschel Rothschild understood that wealth could only really grow if it didn't stop in one place. Money had to be able to travel, information had to be faster than the competition, trust had to exist across borders, and decisions had to be made where politics, trade, and war intertwined. From this insight emerged the very foundation of Rothschild power, a family network that spanned several capitals of Europe and remained more closely connected than many state administrations of its time. Mayor Amschel had 5 sons, and each of them was to play a special role in this nascent system. Amschel Mayer stayed in Frankfurt, Salomon Mayer went to Vienna, Nathan Mayer worked in London, Karl Mayer established connections to Naples, and James Mayer, the youngest of the brothers, became the central figure in Paris. This distribution was no coincidence. It followed a clear strategic logic. Frankfurt was the origin, an important trading and financial center in the Holy Roman Empire and later in the German Confederation. London was the center of British world power, maritime trade, and state finances. Vienna was the capital of the Habsburg monarchy and thus a heart of European diplomacy. After the Revolution and Napoleon, Paris once again became a decisive center of power on the continent. Naples connected the family with southern Italy, the Mediterranean region, and the political interests of the Bourbons. Together, these locations formed a network that touched almost all the major political arenas in Europe. The idea behind it was simple and ingenious at the same time. While other banking houses were often tied to one place or relied on changing correspondence, the Rothschilds could rely on brothers. In an age when news traveled slowly, contracts were based on personal trust, and fraud or misunderstandings could destroy entire fortunes, the family itself was a security mechanism. One brother did not have to distrust the other as a foreign business partner. Of course, there were also tensions, different temperaments, and occasional differences of opinion within the family. But at their core, they were united by a common interest, a common origin, and a common idea that the success of the individual always meant the success of the house. Mayor Amschel had deliberately promoted this unity. He was not only a trader and financier, but also a family strategist. In his thinking, the family's fortune was not merely private property, but an instrument that had to be protected by coherence. He attached great importance to the fact that the brothers stuck together, that important decisions were coordinated within the family, and that control of the company was not easily lost to the outside world. This attitude also shaped the family's marriage policy, which was later often aimed at preserving property, trust, and influence within the close family circle. From today's perspective, this seems strange, but in the context of the time, it was a means of securing wealth and loyalty in an uncertain world. The 5 brothers differed in character and mission. Nathan in London was considered particularly energetic, willing to take risks, and determined. He moved in an environment characterized by global trade, the stock exchange, colonial goods, war financing, and British naval power. London was not just a city, but a hinge between Europe and the world. Those who were successful there were able to gain access to amounts of capital that were of great importance to continental rulers. Nathan recognized early on that Britain had to mobilize enormous financial resources in the wars against Napoleon. He became a key figure in the family home because he was able to combine British financial power with continental payment channels. Salomon in Vienna, on the other hand, moved in a world of courtly diplomacy. The Habsburg monarchy was a multi-ethnic empire with complicated administration, high military obligations, and great prestige claims. Vienna was particularly important after 1815 because the reorganization of Europe was negotiated there. Those who gained access to Austrian state finances and political circles were close to the center of Europe's conservative order. Salomon had to act differently than Nathan. In London, commercial toughness counted. In Vienna, courtly restraint, patience, and diplomatic sensitivity. Both skills were valuable for the family network. James in Paris faced a special challenge. After revolution, terror, empire, and defeat, France was a country full of political tensions. It remained a great power, but a wounded great power. Monarchists, republicans, Bonapartists, liberals, and conservative forces struggled for influence. If you wanted to be successful as a banker in Paris, you not only had to understand financial transactions, but also be able to read political moods. James became one of the most important Rothschilds of his generation. He combined elegance, social skill, and financial intelligence. Under him, Paris became a powerful location for the family. Karl in Naples was given a task that at first glance seemed less important, but was by no means incidental in Europe at the time. The Kingdom of Naples and later the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies were politically closely linked to the European Restoration Order. Southern Italy was a space where Austrian, French, British, and Bourbon interests collided. The Mediterranean remained a strategic area for trade, navies, diplomacy, and power politics. Karl made sure that the family was also present where southern financial flows and dynastic politics were intertwined. Amschel mayor in Frankfurt kept in touch with the origin. Frankfurt remained important for the family, not only for emotional reasons, but also economically. The city was located in a German area that was politically fragmented, but financially vibrant. Many princes, city-states, and territories needed loans, managed their own coffers, and were in contact with larger powers. The Frankfurt location remained a hub from which the family could maintain its identity, its contacts, and its internal balance. The special thing about this system was the combination of proximity and distance. The brothers were geographically separated, but closely connected in business. Letters, couriers, and encrypted messages became the lifelines of the house. At a time when official news was often slow and newspapers reported with a delay, private courier services could provide a significant advantage. In the past, anyone who knew that a war was imminent, that a loan was planned, that a ruler remained solvent, or that a peace agreement was approaching could act accordingly. Information was power, but only if it was reliable and arrived on time. The Rothschilds developed a culture of discretion. They understood that large financial transactions were not secured by loud appearances. Their power often lay precisely in the fact that they acted in the background. This was attractive for governments. States, especially in times of war, did not always want to show publicly how urgently they needed money or which payment channels they used. A bank that could work discreetly, quickly, and internationally was therefore of great value. At the same time, this discretion made the family vulnerable to rumors. What remained hidden could easily be exaggerated. What was confidential was portrayed by opponents as mysterious and threatening. However, one must distinguish exactly between real influence and the legends that arose later. The Rothschilds could not start or end wars at will. They were not invisible rulers of Europe. But they understood better than many others that modern states were dependent on money, credit, and trust. They stood in a place where political decisions had financial consequences and financial opportunities could facilitate or limit political decisions. Therein lay its importance. Not in an all-powerful control, but in an extraordinary ability to act within the existing power structures. The family benefited from a basic problem of the world of states. Governments often needed money exactly when the situation was most uncertain. In peacetime, a state could manage its revenues, plan taxes, and manage debts. In the war, on the other hand, expenditure increased suddenly and enormously. Armies had to be supplied immediately. Allies expected payments. Defeats could cause new costs. At the same time, market confidence fell when the outcome of a war was uncertain. Those who were still able to organize capital in such moments became indispensable. The Rothschild brothers were able to do just that because they were present in several countries and coordinated their business with each other. The family structure also had a psychological effect. For clients and governments, the House of Rothschild increasingly appeared to be a reliable European institution. It was not just a single banker who could die or fail. It was a network of brothers and later sons, nephews and sons-in-law. This continuity generated trust. At the same time, it allowed flexibility. If a political situation in one country became difficult, another location could compensate. If a currency became uncertain, capital could be moved differently. If one government hesitated, information from another capital could help assess the risk. However, the brothers did not act in an empty space. They were part of a world that continued to treat Jewish families with prejudice and restrictions. Their success did not fully protect them from exclusion. On the contrary, it made them more visible and thus more vulnerable. The rise of the Rothschilds came at a time when Jewish emancipation in Europe was progressing slowly, but remained fiercely contested. Their proximity to princely courts could create respect, but also envy and hatred. For many opponents, their success became proof of an alleged secret power, although it was actually the result of hard work, clever organization, political flair, and extraordinary family coordination. Mayor Amschel's greatest achievement was therefore perhaps not only to build up a fortune. His real achievement was the creation of a structure that lasted beyond him. He transformed a Frankfurt trading family into a European financial system. His sons did not simply become heirs, but bearers of a joint project. Each of them stood in a different political world, but all were connected by origin, interests, and strategy. This model made the Rothschilds a special player in the era of the Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent European reorganization. When Europe was drawn into the great conflicts of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, this structure was already prepared. The family had locations, contacts, experience, capital, and an internal network of trust. This is precisely what made them valuable in an era in which borders shifted, armies marched, states accumulated debt, and news of victory or defeat could change fortunes. Mayor Amschel's 5 sons were therefore not only family members. They were the pillars of a new type of power, not territorial, not military, not royal, but financial, communicative, and European. Chapter 4. Revolution, War, and Credit. When the revolution broke out in France in 1789, not only a political upheaval began, but a new era of European warfare. What at first seemed like an internal crisis of the French kingdom soon developed into an event that changed the entire continent. France was financially exhausted, socially torn, and politically blocked. The monarchy had accumulated enormous debts over decades, not least through costly wars and support for the American independence movement against Britain. The state needed reforms, but the privileged estates defended their special rights. The crown's lack of money turned into a crisis of legitimacy, the crisis of legitimacy into a revolution, and finally a war that would not let go of Europe for more than 2 decades. For the old monarchies of Europe, the French Revolution was a threat that reached far beyond France. It wasn't just about a king losing power. It was about the fact that the basic order of the European princely world was called into question. If a people could declare that sovereignty no longer emanates from the ruler alone, but from the nation, then this was an attack on the dynastic thinking that had shaped Europe for centuries. If privileges were revoked, church property confiscated, and aristocratic rights abolished, then this movement could also find imitators in other countries. From the point of view of the monarchies, France was not only a crisis-ridden neighbor, but a political fire that could spread. The revolution itself was closely linked to the financial question from the beginning. The convocation of the Estates General in 1789 had become necessary because the French state could no longer solve its debt crisis by ordinary means. Taxes were unfairly distributed, many privileged people made only limited contributions, and the crown could not simply push through new revenues against the resistance of powerful groups. This revealed a fundamental problem of the old order. The state wanted to act in a modern way, but had a social structure that hindered modern financing. He needed money like a growing power state, but in many areas remained trapped in class privileges and political rigidity. As the revolution became more radical, the situation worsened. The issuance of paper money, the so-called assignats, was intended to alleviate the financial hardship, but in the long term it led to inflation and loss of confidence. The state resorted to confiscated church property, but property could not simply be converted into stable purchasing power. Money lives on trust, and trust was difficult to maintain in a country that stood between revolution, internal violence, emigration, war, and political uncertainty. The revolutionaries fought not only against external enemies and internal opponents, but also against the fragility of their own financial system. For European financial institutions, this situation was dangerous and at the same time full of opportunities. War and revolution were able to destroy assets. They could block trade routes, devalue currencies, ruin debtors, and destroy political relations. But they also created a huge demand for capital, gold, loans, bills of exchange, and payment services. States that waged war needed money immediately. They could not wait until taxes had been slowly collected. Armies had to be supplied, soldiers expected pay, weapons had to be bought, horses procured, fortresses repaired, and allies supported. Anyone who could reliably move money in this world became extremely important to governments. It was here that the space began to open up in which the Rothschild family could become a European factor. Mayor Amschel Rothschild had already built up a solid business in Frankfurt and established important relationships. But the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars changed the scale. Regional financial services became international tasks. Trade transactions became political operations. The question of whether a prince needed money became the question of whether entire states could continue their warfare. The Rothschilds were not the only bankers of the time, and they were not yet the all-powerful house at the beginning of the revolution as they were later portrayed as. But they possessed qualities that became particularly valuable in this era: mobility, international contacts, discretion, trust within the family, and the ability to use information quickly. The wars of the revolutionary period differed from many earlier conflicts. Although earlier wars had also shaken Europe, a new political energy was now added. France waged war not only as a kingdom, but soon as a revolutionary nation. The army was more closely linked to national mobilization. The levée en masse, the mass conscription of 1793, made it clear that modern states could not only use professional soldiers or recruited troops, but mobilized entire populations for war. This increased military strength, but also financial pressure. A larger army meant greater costs, more supplies, more administration, and a stronger link between the state, business, and society. The monarchies of Europe had to respond to this challenge. Austria, Prussia, Great Britain, Russia, and other powers were faced with the question of how to survive against a revolutionary France that mobilized its population ideologically and militarily. But they also need money for this. Great Britain in particular was in a special situation. It had a strong fleet, an extensive trade and colonial empire, and a comparatively developed credit system. London was able to raise enormous sums because the British state enjoyed great confidence in the financial markets. This trust was a weapon. It allowed Britain to last longer wars, support allies, and later confront Napoleon with a combination of naval power, money, and diplomacy. It is precisely at this point that it becomes clear why financial history and military history cannot be separated. An army does not only march with courage, discipline, and strategy. She marches with bread, ammunition, shoes, horses, wagons, mercenaries, supply magazines, and bills. Every campaign is also a logistical and financial operation. The most brilliant victory could become worthless if the supply collapsed. A government could be politically determined, but without money, it had to compromise, reduce troops, or disappoint allies. Money did not decide alone, but it set limits. It determined how long a war could be waged, how many fronts remained open, and which alliances were realistic. For bankers, this meant a delicate position. They could benefit from wars, but at the same time they had to remain cautious. A loan to the wrong state could be lost. A political defeat could destroy an entire financial business. Too close contact with a government could be dangerous if the balance of power changed. Especially at a time when France, Austria, Prussia, and other powers repeatedly experienced victories and defeats, political neutrality was hardly possible, but open partisanship was risky. A financial institution therefore had to think not only economically, but also diplomatically. It had to recognize when caution was required, when speed was needed, and when a deal contained more political risk than the profit warranted. The Rothschilds learned during this time that information was almost as important as capital. Those who learned early on that an army had been defeated, that peace negotiations were beginning, or that a government was planning new loans were better able to act. News traveled slowly and unevenly back then. Official reports were delayed, newspapers were often inaccurate, and rumors could set markets in motion. Private couriers, trusted correspondence, and family connections therefore became a decisive advantage. The later Rothschild network was not only a money network, but also a messaging system. In times of war, this ability could gain enormous importance. At the same time, this era created the breeding ground for later misunderstandings. When bankers moved money for states, when they made profits in times of war, when they were close to governments and had important news earlier than others, this seemed mysterious to outsiders. Many people saw only the result. A family became richer while Europe suffered. They did not see the risks, the technical processes, the dependence on government decisions, and the fact that bankers did not command armies. Complex financial operations later became simple narratives about alleged secret power. That's why you have to tell this story carefully. The Rothschilds were part of a system that financed war, but they were not the cause of the European wars. The real causes lay deeper. They lay in the crisis of the French monarchy, in social tensions, in the ideas of revolution, in the fear of monarchies, in dynastic interests, in territorial rivalries, in British-French competition, and in the imperial logic of the European world of states. Financial institutions could not create these conflicts, but they could play a role in them. They provided funds, organized payments, and helped states to maintain their ability to act. As a result, they were close to power, but they did not replace power. With the rise of Napoleon, this combination of war and credit took on a new dimension, and Napoleon understood like few others how closely military speed, political control, and economic resources were connected. His armies moved rapidly, living partly from the occupied territories and forcing defeated states to make payments, alliances, or territorial losses. As a result, war became even more of an instrument of state reorganization. For his opponents, on the other hand, the need for long-term financing grew. Great Britain in particular became the financial backbone of the anti-Napoleonic coalitions. It fought not only with fleets and troops, but also with subsidies, loans, and gold payments to allies. In this situation, what Mayor Amschel had built up became a historic opportunity for his sons. The war created uncertainty, but also demand. The family was able to use their locations to organize payments across borders. London, Frankfurt, Vienna, Paris, and later Naples were not just places on a map, but nodes of a European system. As armies marched and governments fell, the family network tried to remain mobile. It adapted, observed, communicated, and took advantage of opportunities without underestimating the dangers. So the revolutionary period became the school of the Rothschilds. She showed them that modern power works on multiple levels. On the visible level stood soldiers, cannons, emperors, kings, and battles. At the less visible level, credit, solvency, confidence, news, and debt had an effect. If you only look at the battles, you don't fully understand the era. Anyone who only looks at money fails to recognize the political and ideological violence of that time. Only together does the picture emerge of a world in which war and finance have been inextricably intertwined. At the end of this chapter, therefore, there is a crucial insight. The Rothschild family did not become important because it created the storm of revolution. It became important because it learned to navigate this storm. As Europe entered an era of almost continuous wars, the need for reliable financial actors grew. States fought for territories, ideologies, and the balance of power, but they all faced the same sober question: who pays for the war? It was precisely this question that led the Rothschilds from Frankfurt's Judengasse into the great political and military contexts of Europe. Chapter 5. Napoleon and the Blockade of Europe. When Napoleon Bonaparte rose to become the dominant figure in Europe, the character of the war changed again. He was not only a general who moved armies faster than many of his opponents, not only a political ruler who formed a new empire from the ruins of the revolution, but also a power strategist who understood that modern wars were not decided on battlefields alone. Anyone who wants to understand Napoleon must therefore not only look at Austerlitz, Jena or Wagram, but also at ports, custom stations, trade routes, credit markets and flows of goods. Because against his most stubborn opponent, Great Britain, Napoleon could not simply march with an army. The British Isles were protected by their fleet. Therefore, he resorted to another weapon, economic warfare. Great Britain was Napoleon's biggest obstacle on the way to European domination. On the continent, he could defeat armies, force states, impose alliances, and install or overthrow monarchs. But Britain remained beyond its direct reach. The Royal Navy dominated the seas, protected British trade routes, and made a French invasion almost impossible. By the time of the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 at the latest, it was clear that France could not decisively defeat Britain at sea. So Napoleon had to find another way to break British power. He wanted to suffocate the country economically, cut off its exports from the European market, ruin its merchants, and put financial pressure on its government. This consideration gave rise to the Continental Blockade. With the Berlin Decree of 1806, Napoleon declared that the British Isles were blockaded and that trade in British goods would be prohibited. Later, this policy was tightened by further decrees. In essence, the entire European continent was to be closed to British products. No British cloth, no colonial sugar, no coffee, no industrial goods, no trading business was to enter European markets undisturbed. Napoleon wanted to hit Great Britain where its strength lay, in trade, industry, credit, and in the global interdependence of its economy. But such a system was easier to order than to enforce. Europe was not a single economic area that could be easily controlled from Paris. It consisted of coasts, borders, rivers, ports, ancient trade relations, local interests, and countless people who lived from the exchange of British goods. Traders, shipowners, smugglers, merchants, consumers, civil servants, and even some governments had reasons to circumvent the ban. British goods were in demand because they were often good, cheap, or simply indispensable. Colonial goods such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, and cotton have long been part of European consumption and industrial production. Those who banned these goods not only affected Great Britain, but also their own allies and subjects. Thus, the Continental Blockade became a huge experiment in political control. Napoleon demanded that dependent states, allies, and occupied territories submit to his economic policies. Ports had to be monitored, goods confiscated, merchants checked, and smuggling combated. The lockdown reached deep into daily life. It affected not only ministers and generals, but also dock workers, shopkeepers, sailors, farmers, textile producers, and consumers. Suddenly, a sack of coffee, a bale of cloth, or a shipload of sugar could become a political issue. Trade was no longer just trade, but part of an imperial power struggle. For Napoleon, this policy was logical. If he could not conquer Britain militarily, he would have to attack its economic foundations. But the consequences were contradictory. Great Britain certainly suffered burdens, had to look for new markets, and deal with economic difficulties at times. But the British trading world was flexible. It switched to markets outside Europe, deepened relations with America, India, Latin America, and other regions. The British fleet remained strong enough to protect sea routes and continue its own trade despite setbacks. Napoleon could rule the continent, but not the oceans. This was exactly where the decisive difference lay. For the continent itself, the consequences were often severe. In many regions, prices rose, certain goods became scarce, industries suffered from disrupted supply chains, and dissatisfaction grew. Especially in port cities that lived from international trade, the closure was perceived as a burden. Merchants lost business, sailors lost jobs, consumers lost access to goods. At the same time, smuggling flourished. The stricter a ban was, the more valuable the prohibited goods became. Coasts, islands, border regions, and neutral trading centers became spaces in which laws were circumvented, officials were bribed, and risks were calculated. Smuggling was not only criminal energy, but also a reaction to economic hardship and political overreach. It is precisely in this area of tension between prohibition and reality that financial networks became particularly important. If goods could no longer be traded openly, payments had to be organized more covertly. When borders were uncertain, reliable contacts were needed. When exchange rates fluctuated, when currencies came under pressure, when gold became scarce or payments had to pass through occupied territories, then experienced bankers and traders were indispensable. The continental blockade made money movements more complicated, but not impossible. It changed paths, increased risks, and made trust even more valuable. For the Rothschild family, this time meant a dangerous, but also formative phase. Their network was created in a world where political boundaries were constantly shifting and where any connection to a power could be risky. On the one hand, Great Britain was Napoleon's great opponent and a center of later Rothschild power. On the other hand, Frankfurt, Paris, Vienna, and other important places were within the sphere of influence or within reach of Napoleonic policy. Anyone who did business in this world had to act extremely carefully. One wrong step could be considered political partisanship. A payment could arouse suspicion. A trade contact could be dangerous. But it was precisely this uncertainty that increased the value of those players who nevertheless found ways to move capital, news, and goods. Nathan Mayer Rothschild and London in particular gained in importance during this era. London was the heart of the British financial system and at the same time the most important antithesis to Napoleon's continental system. Britain needed not only military strength, but also the ability to support allies on the continent. Money had to reach Europe, even though France controlled or threatened many routes. Gold, bills of exchange, and credit became tools of British warfare. Those who were able to organize such transfers were at a sensitive interface between trade, war, and diplomacy. The Rothschilds should not be misunderstood as the sole masters of a secret system. Many merchants, bankers, merchants, and government agencies worked on similar problems. But the Rothschilds had a special structure. The brothers were located in different centers in Europe, knew local conditions, were able to exchange information, and trust each other. At a time when official channels were blocked, slow, or dangerous, such a family network could offer a decisive advantage. The continental blockade showed them that power lay not only in owning money, but in being able to move money despite obstacles. Napoleon's economic war also revealed a weakness of his rule. The more countries he controlled, the more he had to monitor. The larger his system became, the more susceptible it became to resistance, exceptions, corruption, and excessive demands. The continental blockade forced Napoleon to intervene more and more deeply in the affairs of other states. Anyone who did not comply with the ban was punished. Anyone who tolerated British goods was considered unreliable. This policy put a strain on allies and contributed to the fact that Napoleon's rule was perceived not only as military but also as economic foreign rule. This was particularly evident on the Iberian Peninsula and later in relations with Russia. Russia became a key problem. The Russian nobility and the Russian economy suffered from the restrictions on trade. Russia wanted to export grain, timber, raw materials, and other goods and needed certain imported goods in return. The continental blockade stood in the way of these interests. As Tsar Alexander I increasingly broke away from Napoleon's system, this became one of the factors that paved the way for the Russian campaign of 1812. This showed how an economic war could turn into a major military conflict. Napoleon wanted to enforce economic discipline, but in the end this logic drove him into disaster. The blockade of Europe was therefore more than a trade policy measure. It was an attempt to put an entire continent at the service of an imperial war. It showed how closely business, military, and politics were intertwined. It made it clear that modern power could not be secured by victories on the battlefield alone. A ruler also had to control markets, direct financial flows, discipline allies, and maintain the loyalty of societies. Napoleon was militarily brilliant, but his economic war overwhelmed the reality of Europe. People don't just act according to decrees. They follow needs, habits, interests, and survival strategies. For the Rothschilds and other financial actors, this era was a school of adaptation. They learned that large political systems have gaps. They learned that bans create new paths. They learned that information, trust, and speed could be more important than official power in times of crisis. While Napoleon tried to direct Europe's trade from above, merchants and bankers moved through a web of opportunities, risks, and gray areas. Not every process was spectacular, not every transfer politically decisive, but together these movements formed the invisible underground of war. In the end, Napoleon's attempt to break Britain through economic isolation failed. British naval power remained, trade adapted, and the continent often suffered more from the blockade than its actual adversary. But this phase was decisive for the history of war financing. It showed that the battle between Britain and France was not only fought with armies, but also with markets, loans, ports, and goods. It created conditions under which financial networks gained enormous importance. And it prepared the phase in which the Rothschilds were to become particularly visible, the financing of the British war against Napoleon and the supply of the Allied forces on the continent. Thus, the continental blockade became a symbol of Napoleon's strength and his borders at the same time. It showed his will to shape Europe according to its political purpose. But it also showed that no ruler could completely control all the flows of goods, needs, and interests of a continent. Between prohibitions and reality, a space emerged in which traders, smugglers, bankers, and states looked for ways to remain capable of acting. It was precisely in this space that the Rothschild family moved. Not as the secret leader of history, but as part of that financial and informal world without which the Great War against Napoleon can hardly be understood. Chapter 6. Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London. When Nathan Mayer Rothschild came to Britain at the end of the 18th century, he entered a world that was very different from Frankfurt. London was loud, fast, rich, contradictory, and full of opportunities. Goods from all parts of the world converged here. Ships brought sugar, cotton, tea, coffee, spices, metals, and colonial products to the ports. Merchants traded with America, India, the Caribbean, and the European continent. Insurers calculate risks on the world's oceans. Bankers finance trade, industry, and war. The stock market reacted to news from Europe, rumors of naval battles, prices for raw materials, and the question of whether Britain could hold out in the long fight against France. For a young man from Frankfurt's Judengasse, London was not simply a larger city. It was another universe of power. Nathan Mayer Rothschild was not Mayor Amschel's eldest son, but he soon became perhaps the most dynamic figure in the family network. He had energy, toughness, the courage to take risks, and a sense of where money would get moving. At first he was active in the textile and goods trade, especially in Manchester, a center of the emerging industrial world. This experience was important because it brought him into contact with the British economic reality. Britain was not only a maritime power, but also a country in which industrial production, global trade, and finance grew ever closer together. Cotton, machinery, factories, ports, credit, and insurance were part of a system that produced a new kind of power. Those who understood this system could grow far beyond traditional trading. Nathan realized early on that London offered more than commodity stores. This was the financial heart of a world power. The British state had built up a particularly developed system of national debt compared to many continental European monarchies. He was able to borrow large sums because his institutions were considered comparatively reliable, because Parliament approved taxes, because the Bank of England played a central role, and because investors believed that Britain would service its debts in the long term. This ability was crucial in the war against Napoleon. While France dominated large parts of Europe militarily, Britain was able to develop a strength at sea, in trade and on the financial markets that Napoleon could never completely break. For Nathan, London was the ideal place to turn the family business into a major European financial powerhouse. He did not act in isolation, but as part of the Rothschild network. His brothers in Frankfurt, Paris, Vienna, and later Naples were able to provide information, maintain contacts, and accompany business on the continent. Nathan, on the other hand, was at the source of British financial power. This connection became particularly important during the Napoleonic Wars, as Britain needed to support its allies on the continent. It was not enough to have money in London. This money had to reach in usable form where armies stood, where governments expected payments, and where alliances had to be stabilized. This was difficult because Napoleon controlled many land routes, because currencies fluctuated, because gold could be scarce, and because every movement of money entailed political risks. A central task was to provide gold and means of payment for British operations. Armies needed not only political support, but also concrete purchasing power. Soldiers had to be paid, supplies bought, suppliers compensated, and local markets used. The war on the Iberian Peninsula against Napoleon's troops in particular showed how important financial logistics was. The British General Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, fought against French forces in Portugal and Spain. His army needed reliable supplies and payments. Paper loans from London were of little help when gold or accepted bills of exchange were needed locally. So the war was also a question of transport, conversion, trust, and speed. In this context, Nathan Rothschild became an important financial service provider to the British government. His strength lay not only in raising capital, but also in finding ways to make that capital practically usable. Transporting gold across a war-torn Europe was dangerous. Ships could be intercepted, roads could be blocked, courses could change, and political changes could suddenly make business impossible. Therefore, a network was needed that could react flexibly. The Rothschilds used family connections, correspondence, dealer contacts, and their growing reputation to organize payments. This was valuable for governments because they needed someone who not only promised money, but could actually deliver. Nathan moved in a world in which trust and mistrust were constantly next to each other. The British government needed private bankers, but did not want to become completely dependent on them. Bankers, on the other hand, were able to make large profits from government contracts, but bore considerable risks. If a delivery failed, if prices were unfavorable, or if a political turnaround occurred, losses could be enormous. Nathan was considered someone who took such risks with determination. His appearance was often described by contemporaries as direct, sometimes brusque, but extraordinarily effective. He was not a courtly diplomat like some of his brothers on the continent. He was a man of the London market who made quick decisions and took advantage of opportunities. His success was also related to the special position of Great Britain. While Napoleon tried to cut Europe off from British trade through the continental blockade, London remained a center of global connections. The Royal Navy protected many sea routes, British merchants sought new markets, and financial markets adapted. This did not mean that Britain did not experience crises. The war was expensive, the burden was great, and economic tensions were real. But the British state was able to hold out longer than many opponents had expected. He financed not only his own troops and fleets, but also coalitions against Napoleon. This ability was a decisive advantage. Britain could act where its armies alone were not sufficient, namely through money, subsidies, and diplomatic support. Nathan Rothschild was at a point where this British strategy took practical shape. He moved between government, market, and family network. He needed to know when to buy gold, how to make payments, what bills of exchange were accepted, and what political developments to expect. Information was indispensable. The Rothschilds built up their own messaging system, which allowed them to react faster and more reliably than many competitors. Couriers, letters, and personal contacts were of enormous value in a time without modern communication. Anyone who received a message a few hours or days earlier could have a decisive advantage on the stock market, exchange rates, or government bonds. It was precisely this information advantage that later contributed to the creation of legends. The most famous story concerns the Battle of Waterloo. According to a widespread, but highly exaggerated and in this form untenable story, Nathan Rothschild is said to have learned of the victory over Napoleon earlier than the British government and to have used this knowledge to manipulate the market. Such stories were later embellished and often served to portray the Rothschilds as mysterious rulers of war and the stock market. Historically, however, a sober view is decisive. Yes, the family had fast information channels. Yes, news could bring financial benefits. But it does not follow that it directed battles or secretly controlled Europe's fate. The real influence was significant enough. It doesn't have to be made bigger by legends. Nathan himself became extraordinarily wealthy through his business dealings in London and made the British house of the Rothschilds one of the most important parts of the family. But wealth alone does not explain its importance. More importantly, he embodied a model that was to become formative for the 19th century. The internationally networked financial actor who does not replace states, but influences their ability to act. Governments could continue to exist without bankers, but in times of crisis they needed credit, payment channels, and market confidence. A bank that could offer these things became politically relevant, even without owning a ministry. This form of power was difficult to see, but very effective. At the same time, despite his success, Nathan remained in a society that viewed Jewish advancement with ambivalence. Britain offered greater economic opportunities compared to some parts of Europe, but prejudices did not disappear. Jewish bankers could be needed and admired, but at the same time viewed with suspicion. Their success aroused envy, their international networks were interpreted as foreign or suspicious, and their proximity to state finances made them targets of political criticism. The Rothschilds therefore had to constantly balance between visibility and discretion. Too much proximity to power could be dangerous. Too little visibility could limit trust. Nathan probably understood this tension better than many of his critics suspected. He knew that a banker in war didn't just have to calculate. He had to read political moods, recognize state needs, distribute risks, and protect his family. Each major assignment could accelerate the rise, but it could also create enemies. Any gain in war could later be morally attacked, even if the actual decisions about war and peace were made by governments. This moral tension is part of the history of war financing. Anyone who finances states in war becomes part of the war, even if he does not give orders himself. It enables action without necessarily setting the causes. This is precisely where the difficult historical assessment lies. In London, Nathan Mayer Rothschild became a man who embodied the new era. He came from a family whose origins lay in the narrow confines of Frankfurt's Judengasse, and now moved at the center of a world power. He traded in goods, gold, bills of exchange, and state finances. He combined private interests with public needs. He used a family network that could act faster and more cohesively than many competitors. And it gained importance in a war that shook Europe not only militarily, but also financially. When Napoleon extended his rule over the continent, London became the antithesis, and Nathan became one of those actors who strengthened this antithesis by practical means. His story shows that the battle against Napoleon was not decided by battles alone. Behind the armies were funds, behind the funds were credit, behind credit was trust, and behind trust were people who were willing to take risks. Nathan Mayer Rothschild was one of those people. Not as an invisible ruler of history, but as an extraordinarily capable financier in a time when money, war, and politics were inextricably linked. Chapter 7. Gold for Wellington. As the war against Napoleon entered its decisive phase, it became increasingly clear that victory did not depend solely on great battles, courageous attacks, or ingenious campaigns. Behind every army was a second, less visible front, the front of supply, payments, loans, and gold. Soldiers could be as brave as they were, officers as determined as they were, strategists as clever. When an army received no pay, when food was lacking, when suppliers were not paid, and when allies lost trust, military strength began to disintegrate from within. This is precisely why financing the war against Napoleon was one of the most important tasks of the British government. And it was here that Nathan Mayer Rothschild became an important figure. The scene where this connection between war and money was particularly evident was the Iberian Peninsula. Since 1808, British, Portuguese, and Spanish forces fought against the French occupying forces. Napoleon had believed that he could force Spain and Portugal into his system, but the resistance proved tough, bloody, and politically dangerous. The war in Spain and Portugal became a wound for France that would not heal. Guerrilla fighters attacked French troops, supply routes were disrupted, cities rose up, and the British Army under Arthur Wellesley, later Duke of Wellington, became an increasingly serious enemy. But Wellington's success was not only based on tactical skill. It was also based on the fact that his army was better supplied and financed than many French units, which were increasingly suffering from overstretching, partisan warfare, and supply problems. Wellington was a cautious, disciplined, and sober commander. He knew that an army could not live on glory. They needed bread, meat, ammunition, shoes, horses, wagons, clothing, medical care, and reliable payments. This was particularly difficult on the Iberian Peninsula. The landscape was harsh, the roads often poor, the political situation complicated, and local resources were limited. When British troops operated in Portugal and Spain, they had to deal with the population, local authorities, suppliers, and allied forces. Many of these people did not accept mere promises from London. They wanted payment in a form they trusted. Paper money or distant promises were often worth little. Gold and silver, on the other hand, were understood, accepted, and respected. This made the procurement and transport of precious metals a military task of the first order. Britain had financial strength, but money in London did not automatically help Wellington in Portugal or Spain. The challenge was to convert British financial power into concrete purchasing power in the theater of war. This meant that gold had to be procured, bills of exchange had to be organized, payments had to be routed through dangerous spaces, and risks had to be hedged. Every transport could be intercepted. Any change of course could cause losses. Any delay could make soldiers restless, make suppliers suspicious, and jeopardize military operations. Nathan Mayer Rothschild recognized precisely this gap between state assets and military reality. The British government could approve money, but it needed men and houses that could practically move it. Nathan had contacts, experience, and the ability to trade in different financial areas at the same time through his London home and through his brother's network. His family was present in Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and later Naples. This geographical distribution was useful in peacetime, but especially valuable in wartime. It made it possible to check information more quickly, direct payments via alternative channels, and better assess local conditions. However, the task was not easy. Europe was permeated by Napoleon's rule, his allies, his enemies, and his blockades. Trade routes were politically charged. Borders could change. An area that was accessible today could be controlled by French troops tomorrow. In addition, there was the continental blockade, with which Napoleon had tried to cut Great Britain off economically from the European market. This lockdown made British financial operations on the continent more difficult, but could not prevent them completely. Precisely because official channels were difficult, private networks, discrete contacts, and flexible forms of payment became all the more important. Gold had a special significance in this regard. In a world of different currencies, uncertain state coffers, and fluctuating paper values, gold was a language that was understood almost everywhere. It was heavy, visible, dangerous to transport, and not infinitely available, but it had confidence. Those who could supply gold did not only supply metal. He provided security. For Wellington, this meant that he could use gold to pay local suppliers, procure supplies, and ensure the discipline of his army. For the British government, this meant that it could continue the war on the continent with gold without having to rely solely on uncertain promises of credit. Nathan Rothschild's role was to make such operations possible. He bought gold, organized payments, and used his network to get British funds where they were needed. He did not act out of pure loyalty or idealism. He was a businessman. He earned from risks, commissions, courses, and his ability to perform tasks that others could not. But that was precisely the essence of war financing. The state needed private competence, and private bankers took advantage of state needs. This resulted in a relationship of mutual dependence that was both productive and morally tense. Because the question remains, what does it mean to earn money from a war? The Rothschilds were not on the battlefield. They did not give orders to attack. They did not decide Wellington's strategy, and they did not cause Napoleon's wars. But by facilitating payments, they became part of the war machine. Without money, no army could fight. No campaign could be waged without supplies. Without credit, alliances could break up. The banker remained in the background, but his work had real consequences. It was able to stabilize armies, keep governments capable of acting, and prolong political decisions. This is precisely the moral difficulty of this story. Financial actors were not the sole perpetrators of violence, but they were part of a system that enabled violence. Wellington himself knew very well how important financial reliability was. He was not a romantic war hero who thought only in terms of attacks and victories. He was a commander who put order, supplies, and discipline above all else. His army was not to roam the country plundering, because plundering could turn the population against them and destroy the political basis of the campaign. But an army that was not supposed to plunder had to be able to pay. Moral discipline was therefore also a financial question. When soldiers were supplied and suppliers received money, it was easier to maintain order. If payments were not made, the risk of violence, unrest, and collapse increased. Here the big politics were combined with the everyday life of the war. In London, ministers could talk about coalitions, argue in Parliament about spending, and hope for the fall of Napoleon. But in a Spanish village, the credibility of British power may have been determined by whether a supplier of flour, cattle, or transport animals was actually paid. World politics became tangible in small payments. It is precisely this level that makes the history of war financing so important. It shows that power lies not only in contracts and battles, but also in receipts, bills of exchange, coins, and trust. For Nathan Rothschild, the success of these operations was a huge step forward. With each order fulfilled, the trust of the British government grew. With every successful transfer, his importance increased. He proved that his house could not only act, but deliver in a crisis. This distinguished large financial players from ordinary merchants. Many were able to do business in quiet times. Few were able to act reliably under war conditions, in political uncertainty, and across borders. Nathan made himself indispensable precisely because of this. At the same time, his success also increased the later attack surface. Those who became rich in the war aroused mistrust. Anyone who moved gold was quickly considered mysterious. Those who served governments were attacked by their opponents. And those who also came from a Jewish family encountered old prejudices in Europe that interpreted their rise not as an achievement but as a threat. Real financial operations later became exaggerated stories. Information advantage turned into alleged omniscience. In hostile narratives, government contracts became invented control over governments. That's why you have to stay precise with the story of gold for Wellington. The Rothschilds were important, but they were not omnipotent. They made payments possible, but they didn't direct the entire story. The war on the Iberian Peninsula developed into an ever greater problem for Napoleon. While he spread his forces across Europe, Spain tied up French troops, weakened morale, and showed that military occupation did not mean political control. Wellington used the time, built up his army, waged cautious campaigns, and waited for favorable opportunities. Behind his patience was the certainty that Britain could hold out longer than many continental opponents. This perseverance was not only a question of will, but of financial structure. The British ability to finance war for years, support allies and secure supplies became a strategic weapon. Nathan Rothschild was one of the men who sharpened this weapon. He was not at the center of the official images of history, in which generals, emperors, and battles dominate. But without people like him, the story remains incomplete. Because the fight against Napoleon was not just a drama of bayonets and cannons. It was also a battle of funds, credit lines, and payment channels. Gold could not win a battle alone, but it could ensure that an army was ready when the moment of battle came. By the time the war was nearing its climax, Nathan Mayer Rothschild had proven that the family network was far more than a trading company. It was an instrument capable of combining political crises, military needs, and financial possibilities. The path of gold to Wellington was therefore more than a technical episode. It was a symbol of the new reality of the 19th century. States waged wars with armies, but they kept them alive with money. And those who could move money did not move the world alone, but they were closer to its decisive forces than many contemporaries wanted to admit. Chapter 8. Waterloo and the Birth of a Legend. The Battle of Waterloo is one of those historical events that have developed their own post-history far beyond their military course. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon's armies met the forces of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian troops under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher south of Brussels. For Europe, it was more than a battle. It was Napoleon's last major attempt to secure rule over France once again after his return from Elba and to challenge the old order of the continent. For his opponents, Waterloo was the decision as to whether the years of war could finally end or whether Europe would once again fall back into an unpredictable era of Napoleonic power politics. But while soldiers fought in the mud, cannons shook the fields and commanders fought for every moment, the material for another story was already emerging in the background. The legend that Nathan Mayer Rothschild learned of the outcome of the battle through secret messages and made a huge fortune out of it on the London Stock Exchange. This story is still famous today, precisely because it fits so well with a certain image. A mysterious banker, a fast courier, a crucial piece of news, a nervous stock market, a deliberately spread rumor, and finally a huge profit. It sounds like a historical thriller. But this is precisely where the danger lies. Good stories are not automatically true history. The legend of Waterloo and the Rothschilds was embellished, changed, and politically charged in the course of the 19th century. It was later used especially by those who wanted to ascribe an almost supernatural power to the Rothschild family. A real information advantage, as many bankers and merchants aspired to, became an almost demonic ability to dominate markets and outwit governments in the narrative. Thus, Waterloo became not only a military turning point, but also a scene of myth-making about financial power. To understand this legend, one must first understand the actual meaning of news at that time. In 1815, there were no telegraph connections, no radio stations, no news agencies in the modern sense, and no stock market announcements in seconds. Information moved through messengers, ships, couriers, letters, and newspapers. Those who received a message earlier than others could gain an advantage from it. This was true for governments, the military, merchants, and bankers alike. An early report of a battle could change the value of government bonds. News about peace negotiations could cause prices to rise. A rumor of defeat could cause panic. In such a world, fast and reliable information channels were a precious commodity. The Rothschilds had developed strengths in precisely this area. Their couriers, contacts, and family connections often enabled them to assess political events more quickly than many competitors. However, this does not mean that they could turn the outcome of Waterloo into money at will. The classic legend claims that Nathan Rothschild learned of Wellington's victory earlier than the British government, when public, created the impression of a British defeat by his behavior, thereby induced other investors to sell, and then secretly bought British government bonds at low prices. When the victory was officially announced, prices rose and Rothschild made immeasurable profits. This narrative is dramatic, but it does not stand up to sober historical scrutiny. There is no hard evidence that Nathan Rothschild manipulated the market in this way or made an unprecedented fortune overnight through Waterloo. It is much more likely that the family, like other well-connected financial players, received news early, checked it and acted in a market environment that was already characterized by uncertainty. The origin of the legend has a lot to do with the special position of the Rothschilds. They were successful, internationally networked, Jewish, discreet and connected to state finances. All these elements made them interesting for admirers and suspicious for opponents. At a time when many people barely understood financial markets, the idea of a secret power offered a seemingly simple explanation for complicated processes. Why do prices rise or fall? Why do some banks receive large government contracts? Why can a family from Frankfurt suddenly gain influence in London, Paris, and Vienna? Rather than explain these questions through institutions, creditworthiness, trade networks, political relationships, and economic risks, many preferred to use a personalized narrative. Then it was no longer the modern financial market that was difficult to understand, but a family that was supposedly omnipotent. Waterloo was particularly well suited for such a narrative, because the battle itself had a tremendous symbolic power. Napoleon was not just any defeated general. He was the man who had shaken Europe for years. His final fall ended an era. After Waterloo, Europe was reorganized at the Congress of Vienna and through the subsequent restoration policy. Monarchies stabilized, borders were secured, revolutionary movements were fought, and the balance of power was rebalanced. When such an event is linked to a stock market story, a strong myth emerges: the impression that at the same moment as soldiers were fighting over the fate of Europe, a banker in the shadow of the markets became the real winner. This idea is fascinating because it combines the visible power of armies with the invisible power of money. But it is precisely this fascination that can obscure the view of reality. Nathan Rothschild was already an important financier in 1815. His business with gold, bills of exchange and government payments had made the London house strong. However, his fortune was not based on a single stock market coup after Waterloo, but on years of intensive work, high risk, clever organization, and the special role of Great Britain in the fight against Napoleon. The British government needed payment services, gold transfers, and financial operations on the continent. Nathan delivered. This gave rise to trust, and trust gave rise to other businesses. So the success of the Rothschilds was not so much the result of a secret moment as the result of a long-term structure. Nevertheless, one should not downplay the family's information advantage. In the world of 1815, it could be very valuable. If a courier brought a message to London faster than official channels, it could have economic significance. But an advantage is not the same as total control. Other actors also had messengers, contacts, and speculation opportunities. Markets didn't consist of mindless people who only paid attention to Nathan's facial expression. They were nervous, but they responded to many signals. In addition, the financial consequences of a battle were not always easy to predict. A victory could cause prices to rise, but also raise new political questions. A war could end, but debts remained. States had to service their obligations, structure bonds, and finance new orders. Reality was more complex than legend. But why did the story persist so persistently? One reason is that it intensifies a moral tension. Many people find it unpleasant when someone makes profits in times of war. As soldiers die, while families mourn and countries are devastated, a banker's profit seems like a sign of cold calculation. This tension is real. War financing raises serious moral questions. But moral unease can quickly turn into a false historical claim. It is right to ask how financial actors profited from the war, what responsibility they bore, and what structures made such profits possible. But it is wrong to make unverified claims about secret control or omnipotent manipulation. It is precisely this line that a historical script must draw clearly. Another reason for the longevity of the legend lies in the anti-Semitism of the 19th century and beyond. The Rothschilds were not only seen as wealthy bankers, but as Jewish bankers. In a society in which Jewish minorities have long been marginalized, suspected, and subjected to old prejudices, their success could easily be reinterpreted as hostile narratives. Commercial skill turned into alleged cunning. International networking turned into alleged homelessness. Financial competence became alleged control. The Waterloo story thus became a building block of larger conspiracy myths that were directed not only against a family, but against Jewish life as a whole. Anyone who tells the story of the Rothschilds must therefore be careful, because old myths often continue to have an effect, even if they are disguised in a modern way. The actual Battle of Waterloo also deserves attention. Napoleon tried to defeat his opponents separately before they could fully unite their forces. Wellington held a difficult position with British, Dutch, Belgian, Hanoverian, and other troops. Blücher's Prussian army approached the battlefield despite previous setbacks. The day was marked by delays, attacks on Hougoumont, heavy fighting for La Haye-Sainte, cavalry attacks, artillery bombardment, and finally the arrival of the Prussians, which decisively worsened Napoleon's situation. In the end, the French army collapsed. The military victory was the result of strategy, resilience, mistakes, terrain, timing, and coalition. It was not the work of a banker in London. And yet the story of Waterloo and the Rothschilds shows something important about the 19th century. Battles decided political orders, but news of battles moved markets. Military events immediately became financial events. The outcome of a day could affect government bonds, change credit conditions, trigger trade decisions, and shift political expectations. The modern world began to treat war not only as a battle of armies, but also as a signal to capital markets. In this sense, the connection between Waterloo and financial history is real. Not because Rothschild secretly ruled Europe, but because Europe itself had entered an age in which power, information, and credit were inextricably linked. After Waterloo, the reputation of the Rothschilds continued to grow. They were increasingly seen as a house that remained capable of acting in times of crisis, that had extraordinary news channels, and that could do business with the great powers of Europe. That reputation was an asset. In the financial world, it's not just what you own that counts, but also what others think you can do. If governments believed that a bank could move large sums of money, they were more likely to commission it. If investors believed that a bank had good information, they observed its behavior. Trust and attention reinforce each other. This created a cycle that increased the influence of the family. At the same time, a second story began, the story of suspicion. The more famous the Rothschilds became, the more they became a projection surface. Some saw them as proof of the new power of capital. Others made it a symbol of a world in which money permeated old social orders. Still others used their names to bundle political anger, social insecurity, or anti-Semitic ideas. In these stories, Waterloo became the founding myth of an alleged financial rule, although the historical reality is much more sober and at the same time much more interesting. Because the true story is no less exciting than the legend. It is about a Europe that was exhausted after decades of war. It is about states that bore enormous debts and were looking for new stability. It is about bankers who had learned to act in times of extreme uncertainty. It is about news that had to be faster than official reports. It is about a Jewish family from Frankfurt who, through organization, discipline, and the courage to take risks, came close to the major centers of power. And it is about how real influence became a myth, because many people did not want to see the difference between power and omnipotence. Waterloo finally ended Napoleon's rule, but it also opened a new phase in European financial history. The Great Wars had shown that states could not fight permanently without credit. The peace after 1815 now showed that states could hardly be rebuilt, relieved of debt, and stabilized even without credit. The Rothschilds were ready to play an even greater role in this new order. But the shadow of legend already lay over them. From now on, her name would be associated not only with banking, but also with tales of secret power. The task of history is to separate the two, the real influence of an extraordinary banking family and the myths that arose from fear, envy, ignorance, and prejudice. It was precisely on this border that Waterloo became the birth of a legend that continues to have an impact today. Chapter 9. The myth of the secret world power. Hardly any other European banking family has been surrounded by stories, rumors, and suspicions as much as the Rothschilds. Their real rise was extraordinary enough. An international financial network with houses in London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples emerged from Frankfurt's Judengasse. The family financed states, traded in bonds, moved gold, brokered payments, and gained access to the courts of Europe. But precisely because this rise was so unusual, it was misunderstood, exaggerated, or deliberately distorted by people early on. In the imagination of many opponents, a powerful banking house became an alleged secret world power. Financial transactions turned into dark plans. Information advantage turned into supposed omniscience. Success turned into suspicion. The myth of the secret power of the Rothschilds did not originate in an empty room. It grew at a time when Europe was undergoing profound change. The old order of the estates slowly collapsed, industrial production changed entire societies, bourgeois elites gained influence, states became increasingly indebted, and financial markets became a visible component of political power. Many people hardly understood this new world. In the past, power had been easier to recognize. A king on the throne, a nobleman on his estate, a general at the head of an army. Financial power, on the other hand, was more difficult to grasp. She did not always sit in palaces, did not wear a uniform, and did not necessarily have her own territory. It worked through loans, trust, contracts, news, bonds, and cash flows. Precisely because this power was abstract, it could easily be mystified. The Rothschilds became a symbol of this new hard-to-see power. Her name stood for international connections, for large sums of money, for proximity to governments, and for a family network that operated in several capitals at the same time. For political opponents, disappointed debtors, competing bankers, or anti-Semitic publicists, this offered an ideal target for attack. There was no need to explain the complicated mechanisms of state financing if one claimed instead that a single family was pulling the strings in the background. Such narratives were simple, emotional, and impactful. They made people feel like they had recognized a hidden truth, when in fact they were turning a complex story into an enemy. The anti-Semitic core of many of these myths is particularly important. The Rothschilds were not only rich, not only bankers, not only internationally active. They were Jewish. In Europe, there were deep-rooted prejudices against Jewish people for centuries. In many places, Jews were legally restricted, socially excluded, religiously defamed, and economically suspected. Long before the rise of the Rothschilds, there were narratives linking Jewish minorities to money, usury, betrayal, or secret power. These prejudices were not the result of actual power, but the product of exclusion, religious enmity, and social projection. When a Jewish family actually achieved great economic success, many resorted to precisely these old pictures. This made the attacks on the Rothschilds particularly dangerous. Criticism of bankers, national debt, or war financing can be justified if it remains objective and examines structures. But the Rothschild myths were often not about sober analysis. The aim was to interpret the success of a Jewish family as evidence of a supposedly Jewish conspiracy. This turned a concrete family history into a political bogeyman. The name Rothschild has been used again and again to support larger anti-Semitic narratives. Those who claimed that the Rothschilds had directed wars, bought governments, or planned revolutions often meant not only this family, but served a worldview in which Jewish people were fundamentally portrayed as foreign, dangerous, and manipulative. The legend of Waterloo was a particularly effective example. The narrative that Nathan Mayer Rothschild manipulated the London market with a secret message of the victory over Napoleon was historically greatly exaggerated and not tenable in its familiar form. Nevertheless, it spread because it combined several motives: war, money, secret knowledge, the stock market, and Jewish rise. It turned a real banker into an almost literary figure, a man who supposedly made a huge fortune from the suffering of Europe. This story fit in with the fears of a society that needed and feared the modern financial market at the same time. It was wrong in its exaggeration, but strong in its effect. A closer look shows that the Rothschilds had great influence, but were by no means omnipotent. They could broker loans, place bonds, and organize payments. They were able to advise governments and help shape conditions through their market position. But they could not start wars at will, trigger revolutions, or direct states according to their will. They, too, were dependent on political developments, military decisions, state laws, economic crises, and the trust of other actors. Their assets could grow, but they could also be endangered. Their connections could open up opportunities, but they could also create risks. It is precisely these boundaries that almost completely disappear in conspiracy narratives. Their influence is turned into total control, contacts into domination, and economic success into a secret plan. But why do such stories attract people so strongly? One reason lies in the uncertainty of modern societies. When prices rise, states incur debts, wars break out, or social orders break down, people look for explanations. Structural causes are often complicated. They lie in long developments, in political interests, in economic constraints, in institutions, ideologies, and international power relations. A conspiracy narrative is simpler. It offers a culprit, a clear picture, and a sense of order. Instead of accepting that history is shaped by many forces, she claims that a small group is behind everything. This has a calming effect because it makes chaos explainable. At the same time, it is dangerous because it directs hatred towards real people. The Rothschilds were particularly suited to such narratives because their real history contained some elements that could be easily distorted. They were internationally networked, so they could be accused of not being nationally loyal. They worked discreetly, so you could say they had something to hide. They financed states, so they could be accused of controlling governments. They were successful, so their success could be presented as illegitimate. They were Jewish, so old anti-Semitic images could be activated. Every factual characteristic was turned negative in the hostile narrative. In the 19th century, such ideas spread through pamphlets, newspapers, political writings, caricatures, and later through popular literature. Caricatures depicted bankers as greedy figures, sometimes with clearly anti-Semitic characteristics. Political movements of different persuasions could use the name Rothschild to dramatize their respective criticisms. Conservatives sometimes saw them as representatives of a modern money power that threatened old aristocratic values. Radical critics saw them as symbolic figures of capitalism. Nationalists distrusted their international network. Anti-Semites made an alleged Jewish world conspiracy out of all this. Thus, the name Rothschild became a projection screen onto which very different fears were thrown. This does not mean that the Rothschilds were beyond criticism. They were powerful bankers who earned money from state affairs and profited from the needs of warring or indebted governments. Their business had a political impact. They moved close to rulers and ministers. Through their decisions, they were able to influence the conditions under which states received money. A serious historical consideration must not trivialize this power, but she has to classify them correctly. There is a difference between asking how private banks profited from national debt and claiming that one family secretly directed all wars. The first is analysis. The second is myth. Especially for a script about the Rothschilds and the wars of Europe, this distinction is crucial, because the story of the family leads right into the big questions of modern power. How do states finance war? Who benefits from debt? What role do private actors play in public conflicts? How does money change political decisions? These are important questions. However, they lose their power when they slip into conspiracy narratives. Then history becomes propaganda. Criticism becomes prejudice, and complexity becomes false certainty. The truth is much more exciting than the legend. The Rothschilds were not all-powerful puppeteers. They were extraordinarily skillful actors in an era in which money, war, and the state grew closer together than ever before. They understood the language of credit, the importance of fast news, and the value of international relations. They took advantage of opportunities, took risks and built a family business that gained a prominent position in European financial history. This was precisely where their significance lay. Not in a secret world domination, but in its ability to master the mechanisms of a new era earlier and better than many others. The myth of the secret world power therefore says at least as much about the society that invented it as it does about the Rothschilds themselves. It shows the fear of invisible power, the uncertainty about financial markets, the envy of social advancement, and the destructive power of anti-Semitic prejudices. He shows how people transform complex historical developments into simple enemy images. And he urges us to remain particularly precise, especially when it comes to topics such as war, money, and power. So, as we continue to trace the history of the Rothschilds, we need to keep two levels in mind. The first is the level of verifiable history: banking transactions, government bonds, political contacts, war financing, and European power relations. The second is the level of narratives: rumors, legends, enemy images, and myths. Both levels are part of the family's history of influence. But they must not be confused. Because only when you recognize the myth can you see the real story. And this real history leads us after 1815 into a new European order in which peace had to be financed as much as war had to be before. Chapter 10. After Napoleon, peace on credit. When Napoleon was finally defeated, Europe breathed a sigh of relief. But this peace was not an easy new beginning. The guns fell silent, the armies were repatriated, borders were redrawn, monarchs returned to their thrones, and diplomats declared that the continent had to find order again after more than 20 years of revolution and war. But behind the solemn words lay a sober reality. The war was over, but its costs remained. States were in debt, administrations were exhausted, armies had to be paid, occupation costs had to be settled, reparation payments had to be organized, and damaged economic areas had to be stabilized again. Europe had to be reorganized not only politically, but also financially. After the war, therefore, a second great task began. Peace had to be paid for. The Congress of Vienna of 1814 and 1815 was the visible symbol of this new order. Representatives of the great powers came together to bring Europe back into balance after the Napoleonic upheavals. Austria, Russia, Prussia, Great Britain, and defeated France wrestled over borders, zones of influence, dynasties, and security guarantees. On stage were princes, ministers, and diplomats, especially men like Metternich, Castlereagh, Talleyrand, and Hardenberg. They spoke of legitimacy, stability, and balance. But every political decision also had a financial side. A restored kingdom needed revenue. An enlarged territory needed administration. An occupying army cost money. A state that had to pay reparations needed credit. The map of Europe was drawn in ink, but it had to be supported by taxes, bonds, and cash flows. France was at the center of the problems. The country was defeated, but too important to be simply destroyed or permanently humiliated. After Napoleon's first abdication, the Bourbon monarchy returned, but the political situation remained uncertain. After the 100 Days and Waterloo, the victors tightened their conditions. France had to pay compensation and maintain an occupying army on its soil. These obligations were enormous. At the same time, the new government had to consolidate its own authority, calm internal tensions, and regain the trust of the European powers. To do this, it needed money, and more importantly, it needed credibility. This showed how much peace depended on credit. A state could sign a contract, but if no one believed it could pay, that contract was just paper. Investors had to be convinced to buy French bonds. Other governments had to trust that France would fulfill its obligations. Banks had to be prepared to broker payments and take risks. In this situation, the Rothschilds became important again. They were no longer just actors in financing the war, but became mediators of a post-war European order. The Paris house under James Mayer Rothschild in particular gained in importance, because France needed access to capital and a banking house that could establish connections between Paris, London, Vienna, and Frankfurt. That was a remarkable turn of events. During the fight against Napoleon, the Rothschilds had gained prominence primarily through their connection to British financial power and payments to British and Allied forces. Now, after Napoleon's defeat, they also worked with defeated France. This shows very clearly that bankers did not act according to the same logics as generals. For a state, yesterday's opponent was often politically suspect for a long time. For a financial institution, he could be the debtor, customer, or partner of tomorrow. This flexibility was an advantage, but it also fueled mistrust. Anyone who did business with several powers could be considered pragmatic, but also allegedly disloyal. It was precisely this tension that accompanied the Rothschilds throughout the 19th century. The peace order after 1815 was conservative, but it was not simply backward-looking. The monarchies wanted to overcome the revolution and Napoleonic rule, but they could not return to the world before 1789. Too much had changed. The states had learned to mobilize larger armies, build more complex administrations, and use deeper financial structures. The experience of wars had shown that creditworthiness was a form of state power. Britain had been so strong not least because it was able to take on large debts and still maintain trust. Other states had to learn from this. The modern state was not only a power apparatus of soldiers and civil servants, but also a debtor whose reputation on the financial markets was politically decisive. For the Rothschilds, this development opened up new opportunities. Government bonds became a central business area. If a state needed money, a bank could help issue bonds and place them with investors. This did not simply mean lending money. It meant organizing trust. A bank with a good reputation was able to convince investors that a bond was reliable. It was able to negotiate conditions, assess risks, and send a signal through its own participation. When the House of Rothschild took over or brokered a bond, this could strengthen the confidence of other investors. The name itself thus became an economic tool. However, this reputation was hard-earned and had to be constantly protected. A bank that supported too many bad debtors risked its reputation. A state that failed to meet its obligations damaged not only itself, but also the bankers who brokered its bonds. Therefore, the Rothschilds were very interested in political stability. They observed governments, budgets, ministerial changes, diplomatic conflicts, and social unrest. Not out of mere curiosity, but because all this decided on solvency and creditworthiness. An uprising could shake prices. A change of minister could change a fiscal policy. A war could make a bond risky. Peace was therefore by no means boring for bankers. It was a condition that had to be constantly monitored, calculated, and secured. After 1815, an order emerged in Europe that is often referred to as the Restoration. Old dynasties were supported, revolutionary movements were fought, and the great powers tried to avoid major wars through congresses and agreements. This system was not free of violence and oppression. Liberal, national, and democratic movements were controlled or persecuted in many places. But from the government's point of view, it should create stability. Stability was of great value to financial markets. Investors tended to trust a state that seemed predictable. Bankers preferred governments that serviced their debts and guaranteed political order. This created a natural proximity between large financial institutions and the restorative politics of Europe. This proximity was not necessarily ideological in the narrower sense, but often practical. Order promised solvency. Nevertheless, the peace was fragile. Under the surface, many conflicts lived on. In Italy, the desire for national unity grew. In Germany, liberal and national movements emerged. In France, the memory of revolution and Napoleon remained alive. And in Poland and other regions, independence efforts were brewing. The monarchies could not simply extinguish political ideas. They could monitor, censor, and suppress them, but they could not eliminate them completely. This meant that financial markets had to react to political shocks again and again. Every revolution, every constitutional crisis, every uprising posed the question anew: will this state remain solvent? Will he acknowledge his debts? Will war break out? Will a new government take over old obligations? The Rothschilds were particularly well positioned in this world because they didn't just sit in one place. Their family network allowed them to observe developments from different angles. What appeared to be a security issue in Vienna could be seen as a market opportunity in London. What began as a domestic political crisis in Paris could influence investor sentiment in Frankfurt. The brothers wrote to each other, exchanged assessments, and tried to identify political risks at an early stage. In this way, the family became a kind of European sensorium. She felt tensions before they became visible to the general public. This, too, was not secret knowledge in the mystical sense, but the result of systematic observation and good communication. The role of the Rothschilds in the post-war period also shows that war and peace are more closely connected financially than one might initially think. In war, a state needs money to fight. In peacetime, he needs money to settle debts, dismiss soldiers, pay compensation, restore infrastructure, and regain trust. The Peace of 1815 was therefore not the end of the financial history of the Napoleonic era, but its next chapter. The loans, bonds, and payments of the post-war period were part of the same great development. States became permanently dependent on capital markets, and private banks became intermediaries of this dependence. For the public, this world remained difficult to understand. Many people saw that bankers were close to power, but they didn't understand exactly what they were doing. They saw wealth, palaces, social advancement, and contacts with ministries. But they did not see the technical risks, the obligations, the political dependencies, and the constant danger of a loss of trust. This gave rise to suspicions again. When a state took out a loan, some did not ask about budget problems, war debts, or diplomatic obligations, but looked for secret profiteers. The name Rothschild was mentioned again and again because it visibly stood for an invisible world. But from a historical point of view, it is precisely this visibility that is interesting. The Rothschilds made it clear that power in the 19th century no longer consisted solely of land ownership, noble titles, and military rank. A family without its own territory could become politically significant through capital, credit, and information. This was irritating for the old order and characteristic of the New World. The Restoration period wanted to preserve many things, but it was already permeated by modern financial mechanisms. Monarchies relied on banking houses. States spoke of tradition, but they financed themselves with bonds. Diplomats negotiated balance, but investors helped decide how expensive this balance became. After Napoleon, Europe did not simply become peaceful. It was financially reorganized. The great powers sought stability, but this stability came at a price. France had to become creditworthy again. Austria, Prussia, and other states had to put their finances in order. Great Britain remained a formidable debtor and financial power at the same time. Investors are looking for security and returns. Banking houses like that of the Rothschilds stood between these needs. They helped to channel money, bundle trust, and translate political obligations into financial forms. At the end of this chapter, therefore, there is an insight that is decisive for the entire topic. Peace after 1815 was not a state without a power struggle. It was a new form of power struggle, less visible than Napoleon's battles, but no less significant. States are now fighting for creditworthiness, stability, investor confidence, and diplomatic recognition. The Rothschilds were not secret rulers in this world, but they were important mediators. They understood that after the cannons came the bills. And whoever helped to sort out these accounts was right at the heart of European politics. Chapter 11. Vienna, Paris, London. Banks as political observers. After 1815, Europe was no longer ordered only by armies, monarchs, and diplomats, but increasingly also by those forces that at first glance seemed quieter: credit, confidence, news, and market sentiment. The Congress of Vienna had created a political order that was supposed to contain revolutions and avoid major wars, but this order was not naturally stable. Beneath the surface, old rivalries, social tensions, national movements, and economic uncertainties remained. It was precisely in this world that banks became political observers. They not only had to calculate interest rates and issue bonds, but also read moods, assess governments, anticipate crises and recognize when a state remained trustworthy or when its solvency was at risk. For the Rothschilds, this ability became a central part of their power. The three major centers of Vienna, Paris, and London stood for different forms of European politics. Vienna was the heart of the Habsburg monarchy and the conservative order. There, Prince Metternich worked as one of the most influential statesmen in Europe. He wanted to prevent revolutions, secure monarchical legitimacy, and preserve the balance of power. After the Revolution, the Empire, and the Restoration, Paris was a politically turbulent place where the memory of 1789 and Napoleon never completely disappeared. There, any government crisis could raise the question of whether France would once again become the starting point of European convulsions. London, in turn, was the center of British naval power, world trade, and one of the world's most important financial markets. Those who were present in these three cities did not simply observe local developments. He saw three different nerve centers of a continent whose politics were increasingly intertwined with money flows. For the Rothschilds, this geographical distribution was an invaluable advantage. Salomon Mayer Rothschild in Vienna, James Mayer Rothschild in Paris, and Nathan Mayer Rothschild in London did not form a loose collection of individual bankers, but parts of a family network that combined news, assessments, and capital. While governments had official embassies, the Rothschilds had their own channels. Letters, couriers, confidential conversations, trade contacts, and social relations provided them with information that was crucial for financial decisions. In an era without modern communication, early news of a cabinet crisis, a planned loan, an uprising, or diplomatic tension could have great economic significance. But observation meant more than speed. A message had to be understood. Not every unrest led to a revolution, not every threat to war, not every reform to more stability. Bankers had to interpret political events. They had to assess whether a government was strong enough to service its debts, whether a ministry would last, whether a constitutional crisis would shake the markets, or whether military mobilization was just a means of exerting pressure on negotiations. In this sense, large banking houses became political analysis centers. They observed the world not out of philosophical interest, but because wrong assessments could cost fortunes. Vienna was particularly important to the Rothschilds because the Habsburg monarchy was a vast, multifaceted empire. Austria included German, Hungarian, Czech, Italian, Slavic, and other territories whose political interests did not always coincide. The monarchy needed money for administration, military, infrastructure, and to secure its position in Europe. At the same time, it was a symbol of conservative stability. Anyone who did business with Vienna was not only dealing with a government, but with a political system that feared revolution and nationalism. Salomon Rothschild therefore had to be not only a financier, but also an expert on courtly culture. In Vienna, restraint, respect for rank and ceremonial, patience in dealing with bureaucracy, and a keen sense of the fears of a monarchy that was powerful but remained inwardly vulnerable counted. Paris demanded a different kind of skill. James Rothschild moved in a city where politics, society, and finance were particularly closely connected. France remained a great power despite defeat, but its domestic political order was uncertain. The Bourbons wanted to restore legitimacy, but they had to deal with a society that had experienced revolution, Napoleonic administration, bourgeois advancement, and political mobilization. In Paris, a banker could not only look at ministries. He had to pay attention to salons, newspapers, opposition circles, aristocratic networks, and the mood of the street. The French market reacted sensitively to political signs. A speech, scandal, law, or rumor could take on financial significance. James Rothschild's success was therefore based not only on capital, but on social intelligence. He understood that influence in Paris also came from presence, style, relationships, and cultural flair. London, on the other hand, was different. There, the connection between national debt, Parliament, the Bank of England, the stock exchange, and global trade was particularly pronounced. Great Britain had survived the war against Napoleon and had emerged from it as the leading maritime and financial power. The British national debt was high, but it was precisely its reliable servicing that strengthened the confidence of the markets. London was a place where news arrived from all over the world, from India, the Caribbean, North America, the Mediterranean, Latin America, and European capitals. Nathan Rothschild understood the speed and hardness of the London market. What counted there was not courtly elegance, but decisiveness, a willingness to take risks and the ability to survive in a fierce competition between bankers, brokers, and merchants. These three cities showed that the Rothschilds did not simply run a banking house, but had to act in different political cultures. What created trust in Vienna could have the effect of sluggishness in London. What was considered energetic action in London could appear socially clumsy in Paris. The strength of the family lay in taking advantage of these differences through division of labor. Each brother knew his location, but all were connected. This created a kind of European multilingualism of power. The Rothschilds spoke not only different national languages, but also different political languages: the language of the court, the market, diplomacy, the stock market, and state credit. This ability became particularly valuable in government bonds. If a state wanted to borrow money, a bank had to assess how investors would react. A look at the figures was not enough to do this. Of course, income, debts, interest, and collateral counted. But just as important were political stability, the international situation, and trust in the government. A state could be rich in resources and still receive poor credit conditions if it seemed politically uncertain. Another could carry high debts if investors trusted that he would reliably meet his obligations. Bankers were therefore translators between politics and capital. They turned political assessments into interest rates, risk premiums, and investment decisions. This role gave them influence, but it also made them dependent. The Rothschilds could advise governments and set conditions, but at the same time they had to be careful not to jeopardize their own reputation. When they supported a bond, they put their name on it. If this loan failed, its reputation could suffer. Their influence was therefore not based on unlimited freedom, but on a delicate balance of capital, reputation, and risk control. They could not save every state and could not prevent every crisis. But they could decide who they trusted, which business they took over, and which political signals they took seriously. It was precisely this power of assessment that was often misunderstood by contemporaries. When the Rothschilds brokered a loan, it looked to outsiders as if they had given money to a state and thus made its policies possible. In a way, that was true. But behind this was a complex interplay of investors, markets, government guarantees, payment plans, and political risk. The family was not the sole source of money, but often an intermediary and organizer. It bundled trust. It was powerful, but not magical. Those who did not see this difference easily turned financial technology into myth. For the Rothschilds, political observation also meant recognizing dangers at an early stage. Revolutions were particularly threatening because they raised the question of whether new governments would recognize old debts. National movements have been able to change borders and thus shake the foundations of state finances. Wars could devalue bonds, but also create new demand for credit. Even rumors could be dangerous. A financial institution therefore had to constantly weigh up between opportunity and caution. Too much restraint could cost business. Too much risk-taking could bring losses. This tension characterized daily actions. The proximity of the Rothschilds to governments led to another consequence. They were also used for political information. Ministers wanted to know how markets would react to certain decisions. Governments watched the stance of large banks because this stance could be a signal of trust or distrust. Conversely, bankers were able to exert political pressure through their assessments without having open means of power. If a major banking house deemed a government to be unstable, it could worsen credit conditions. If it showed confidence, it could have a calming effect. This created a silent interaction between the financial world and politics. But this interaction was morally and democratically problematic. Private bankers were not elected accountable to anyone, but they could influence decisions that affected millions of people. When states refrained from certain reforms or implemented austerity measures for fear of a loss of confidence, the power of the creditors became apparent. If governments were able to finance wars or repression because they had access to credit, the question arose as to the responsibility of the creditors. The Rothschilds were part of this larger structure. Their history forces us not only to admire their abilities, but also to take a critical look at the political significance of private financial power. At the same time, this criticism must not slip into simple enemy images. The Rothschilds acted in a world in which states themselves demanded money, waged wars, incurred debts, and wanted to secure political order. Bankers were not innocent bystanders, but they were not the sole architects of history either. They responded to state needs and benefited from them. They took advantage of the leeway offered by the political order. Their influence was real, but it existed within a system shaped by monarchies, parliaments, armies, diplomats, and social conflicts. Vienna, Paris, and London therefore became observation posts of a new European reality. In Vienna, there was a fear of revolution and an attempt to preserve the old order through diplomacy and control. In Paris, one saw the unrest of a society that vacillated between monarchical restoration and revolutionary legacy. In London, they saw the power of a financial market that combined global power with state creditworthiness. The Rothschilds stood in all three worlds at the same time. That made them strong, but also vulnerable. They became intermediaries between states and capital, between news and decision, between risk and trust. In the end, this chapter shows that banks were no longer just financial institutions in the 19th century. They became the eyes and ears of power. They observed political movements, evaluated them, and translated them into financial decisions. The Rothschilds were particularly successful in this because they thought as a family, acted internationally, and understood that information itself was a form of capital. Their power did not lie in secretly controlling every government. It consisted in transforming political reality into financial capacity to act more quickly and precisely. In a Europe that wanted peace but remained full of tensions, this was precisely one of the most important skills of the new era. Chapter 12. The Revolution of 1848. The year 1848 shook Europe like a sudden thunderstorm, but its causes lay long ago. The revolutions that swept from Paris this year to Vienna, Berlin, Milan, Budapest, Prague, and many other places were not the result of a single decision or event. They were the expression of a deep dissatisfaction that had accumulated over decades. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the monarchies of Europe had tried to restore stability. They had rearranged borders, secured dynasties, monitored revolutionary movements, and suppressed liberal demands. But beneath this surface, the pressure grew. Citizens demanded constitutions, freedom of the press, and political participation. National movements demanded unity or independence. Workers, craftsmen, and farmers suffered from economic hardship, rising prices, and insecure living conditions. The old order had survived the war, but it had not solved the questions of the new era. The revolutions of 1848 were a shock for Europe's major financial institutions. They hit not only governments and armies, but also credit markets, stock exchanges, trade flows, and the trust on which public finances were based. Money thrives on the expectation that obligations will be met. A government can only borrow money cheaply if investors believe that it will still exist tomorrow, acknowledge its debts, and control its revenues. Revolutions destroy precisely this certainty. When ministers flee, parliaments are formed, barricades are built, and soldiers vacillate between obedience and rebellion, the question immediately arises as to whether old treaties still apply. For bankers, 1848 was therefore not only a political drama, but a crisis of confidence. The Rothschilds were in a particularly sensitive position at that moment. Their rise had been closely linked to the post-Napoleonic order. They had brokered government bonds, financed governments, organized payment flows, and established themselves in the centers of power. Their influence was based on stability, predictability, and the trust of monarchical states. But now it is precisely these states that are faltering. In Paris, Louis Philippe's July monarchy fell in February 1848. The Second Republic was proclaimed, and the news spread like a spark across the continent. France was once again the starting point of a European upheaval. For many liberals and Democrats, this was a sign of hope. For conservative governments and financial markets, it was a warning signal. Paris had a special significance for the House of Rothschild. James Mayer Rothschild had become an outstanding figure in French financial life there. He was not only a banker, but also a social actor, patron of the arts, railway financier, and liaison between government, capital, and European politics. The fall of the monarchy did not automatically threaten his entire fortune, but it dramatically changed the political environment. A republic could set different priorities than a monarchy. The mood against major financial interests could grow. Workers and smaller citizens who experienced social hardship often saw rich bankers as symbols of an unjust order. In such moments, wealth became visible and dangerous. The Rothschilds had to act cautiously, reassess relationships, and at the same time avoid appearing as opponents of the new power. The crisis also broke out openly in Vienna. The Habsburg monarchy, long regarded as a bulwark of conservative stability, was gripped by unrest. In March 1848 there were uprisings, and Metternich, who had stood for the restorative order of Europe for decades, had to flee. For the Rothschilds, this was more than a symbolic turning point. Salomon Rothschild's position in Vienna had benefited greatly from his relations with the Habsburg government and the aristocratic world. If this world fluctuated, so did the environment in which the bank operated. Vienna was not just any capital. It was a center of the system that wanted to prevent revolutions after 1815. When the revolution itself broke out there, it became clear that the old order was not as firm as it had appeared. The crisis in the Habsburg monarchy was particularly complex because it was not only liberal but also national. In Hungary, political forces demanded more independence. In Bohemia, northern Italy, and other parts of the empire, national and regional interests were articulated. The monarchy was a multi-ethnic empire, and 1848 revealed how difficult it was to control this diversity with central authority. For financial markets, this meant uncertainty on several levels. Would the empire stick together? Would it have to wage war against its own subjects? Would tax revenues remain stable? Would Austria continue to be creditworthy? Each of these questions had immediate financial significance. In Berlin and the German states, a revolutionary dynamic also unfolded. Citizens demanded constitutions, fundamental rights, and national unity. The Frankfurt National Assembly met to discuss a German constitution and the future of a united Germany. For the Rothschilds, this had a special historical resonance, because Frankfurt was the origin of the family. The city, where Mayor Amschel Rothschild had once built up his business from limited circumstances, now became a political center of the German unity movement. But here, too, hope and uncertainty were combined. A united German nation-state would have changed the political map of Europe. For financial institutions, the question arose as to what debts, which currencies, which institutions, and what power relations would arise from this. The revolutions of 1848 showed particularly clearly how closely social need and political demands were connected. The years before had been marked by economic crises, crop failures, and supply difficulties. Many people suffered from high food prices and unsafe working conditions. Craftsmen were under pressure from industrialization and competition. Workers demanded not only political rights, but also social improvement. For Europe's wealthy elites, this was unsettling. They might be able to accept liberal constitutions as long as property and order were protected. But as soon as social demands became stronger, the fear of a deeper upheaval grew. Bankers, entrepreneurs, and property owners feared not only political instability, but also attacks on property, contracts, and capital. The Rothschilds were therefore in a difficult position. On the one hand, They themselves were not old aristocrats in the classical sense. Their rise had been made possible by middle-class, commercial and financial skills. In a way, they embodied the social mobility of the modern world. On the other hand, they had long since become part of the established order. They financed monarchies, associated with princes, possessed great wealth and had an interest in stability. 1848 exposed precisely this ambivalence. The family had risen from a discriminated minority, but their success now linked them to the forces against which many revolutionaries were protesting. This made her position sensitive. For financial markets, 1848 meant a period of strong fluctuations. Bonds could fall if governments were threatened. Capital could flee when uncertainty grew. Investors sought safety, sold risky securities, and waited for political clarity. Banks had to secure liquidity and avoid being drawn into falling markets. The ability to keep calm was crucial. Those who acted in panic could suffer great losses. Anyone who took sides too early could be politically isolated. However, those who were too cautious missed opportunities when the situation stabilized. The Rothschilds therefore had to weigh up, observe, communicate, and use their international connections to avoid being surprised by local crises. The family network once again proved to be an advantage. While barricades were erected in one city, other locations could provide information, secure capital, or supplement assessments. London remained more stable compared to many continental capitals and became an important haven for capital. Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt were more politically shaken. These differences allowed the House of Rothschild to spread risks. But even a network could not simply lift the crisis. The revolutions of 1848 were proof that even the most powerful financial houses were not above the forces of history. They were able to react, but they could not control everything. They could advise states, but not save every government. They could instill, but not enforce, trust when street fighting, national conflicts, and social anger shook order. Over time, many revolutionary movements were pushed back. Monarchies regained the upper hand militarily, liberal hopes were disappointed, and the Frankfurt National Assembly ultimately failed due to questions of power, internal antagonisms, and rejection by the princes. In Austria, the revolution was crushed, and in Hungary, Russian aid finally intervened in favor of the Habsburgs. In France, the path from the Republic soon led to the rise of Louis Napoleon, who made himself emperor in 1852 as Napoleon III. At first glance, the old order seemed to have triumphed. But this impression is deceptive. 1848 had shown that the social, national, and liberal questions had not disappeared. They would return later in a different form. For the Rothschilds, the lesson of 1848 was profound. Stability was not a matter of course. Monarchies could fall, ministers could flee, markets could be shaken, and political movements could encompass the entire continent within a few weeks. The family understood even more clearly that political observation was indispensable for financial power. It was not enough to read balance sheets. Hunger, nationalism, freedom of the press, constitutional struggles, workers' unrest, dynastic weaknesses, and military loyalties had to be taken into account. Each of these forces could have financial consequences. At the same time, 1848 changed the way the public talked about financial power. In times of political excitement, bankers easily became symbolic figures. For some, they were defenders of order, for others profiteers of an unjust system. The name Rothschild continued to be charged in political debates. Those who railed against capital power often named the best-known names. Those who cultivated anti-Semitic prejudices used the crisis to renew old enemy images. Especially in revolutionary times, it becomes clear how quickly justified criticism of social inequality can turn into dangerous personalization and hatred. It was not only the system of state financing that was attacked, but a family became a symbol of everything that many people feared about the modern money economy. Historically, therefore, the significance of 1848 lies not only in the barricades and parliaments, but also in the reaction of the financial world. The revolutions made it clear that credit and politics were inextricably linked. A state could not be credible if its people rejected it. A bond could not remain stable if the government wavered behind it. A bank could not only calculate when the street was burning. Power no longer lay solely in palaces and ministries, but also in the ability to understand social tensions. The Rothschilds had learned this lesson before, but in 1848 it made them particularly aware of the fragility of the European order. In the end, the revolutions of 1848 were neither a complete catastrophe nor a simple triumph for the Rothschild family. They survived the crisis, but they saw that their influence was reaching its limits. They could benefit from stabilization, but they had to realize that the forces of nationalism, liberalism, and social discontent were stronger in the long run than any single financial strategy. Europe continued to change, even if the monarchies initially struck back. The coming decades would bring new wars, new nation-states, new industries, and new forms of political power. The Rothschilds remained important players, but the world in which they acted became more restless, mass, and nationalistic. So 1848 became a turning point. It showed that peace after Napoleon had only been a surface under which unresolved conflicts continued to have an effect. It showed that financial power needed stability, but lived in a world driven by change. And it showed that the name Rothschild no longer stood for just one banking house, but for an entire epoch in which money, the state, revolution, and public opinion were inextricably linked. The barricades of 1848 were not only an attack on old governments. They were also a reminder that no loan, no wealth, and no network is permanently stronger than the political forces of a society that no longer accepts its order. Chapter 13. Wars of Nations and the Power of Bonds. After the revolutions of 1848, Europe entered a new phase. The old monarchies had survived the first great onslaught of liberal and nationalist movements, but they had not defeated the deeper forces of the time. Below the surface, nationalism, industrialization, military reforms, and economic change continued to work. The continent was no longer the same as in the years after Napoleon. People increasingly thought in national categories. States began to modernize their administrations. Railways changed the speed of troop movements and freight transport, and financial markets became increasingly involved in political decision-making. War was no longer just a matter of dynasties and cabinets. It became a tool of national unification, imperial competition, and state modernization. In this world, bonds, loans, and banking houses gained a new meaning. The Rothschilds continued to be at the center of many European financial movements, but their role changed. In the Napoleonic era, the family had gained importance mainly through payment methods, gold transfers, and the financing of war efforts. After 1815, it had become a mediator of the peace order. But from the middle of the 19th century onwards, a new type of conflict emerged. Wars that were fought not only to preserve old balances, but also to shape nations, expand empires, or fundamentally change political orders. Italy and Germany sought unity. France wanted to preserve greatness and prestige. Austria struggled to maintain its position in Central Europe and Italy. Prussia was preparing to turn from a German center of power into the leading power of a new Reich. And Britain observed the continent from the perspective of a world power whose interests extended far beyond Europe. An early example of this new combination of war, diplomacy, and financial power was the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856, when Russia fought against the Ottoman Empire, and later Great Britain and France entered the war on the Ottoman side. Officially, it was about intellectual property rights, the balance of power and influence in the Eastern Mediterranean. In fact, the question was also whether Russia would expand its position at the expense of the Ottoman Empire and thus endanger the European order. The war was fought in Crimea, the Black Sea, the Baltics, and diplomacy. He showed how expensive modern wars had become and how much they depended on transport, supplies, medical care, and public opinion. Railways, steamships, and telegraphs began to change warfare, but costs also rose. For financial institutions, the Crimean War was a signal. States had to mobilize resources on an ever-increasing scale. British and French war financing was able to draw on developed financial systems, but it too relied on trust and market mechanisms. The Ottoman Empire increasingly took out foreign loans and thus became more financially dependent in the long term. This revealed a pattern that became increasingly important in the 19th century. Loans could create political capacity in the short term, but create dependencies in the long term. A state that borrowed for defense or modernization gained time. But when revenue, administration, and economic power were not sufficient, debt became an instrument of foreign influence. The Rothschilds were not the only players in this world, but they were among the most respected financial houses in Europe. Their name could inspire trust, but they acted cautiously. They knew that not every government bond was equally safe, and that political instability could shake the value of debt. Especially in the age of national movements, credit decisions became politically sensitive. Anyone who lent money to a state could indirectly support its military or political goals. Those who refused could strengthen other forces or exclude themselves from future business. Banks were therefore not neutral in a vacuum. They moved in a field of risk, interest, morality, and political calculation. The new era was particularly evident in Italy. Italian unification was not a simple romantic struggle for freedom, but a complicated interplay of national movement, monarchical strategy, French power politics, Austrian weakness, diplomatic calculations, and military risk. The Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont under Victor Emmanuel II and his Prime Minister Camillo Benso of Cavour understood that national goals were hardly achievable without international support. Cavour was not a dreamer, but a cool realpolitiker. He modernized the state, expanded the administration and economy, sought diplomatic alliances, and knew that war against Austria only had a chance of success with the help of a great power. For a time, he found this help from Napoleon III, who wanted to strengthen France's influence in Europe. The War of 1859 against Austria was a decisive step towards Italian unification. Battles such as Magenta and Solferino showed the cruelty of modern mass armies. Solferino later became famous because the suffering of the wounded inspired Henry Dunant to found the Red Cross. But behind the battles was again the question of financing. Piedmont Sardinia had to modernize its army and carry out the war effort. France had to pay for its intervention. Austria had to cope with defeats and stabilize its finances. Every military decision had consequences for bond markets and creditworthiness. The war showed that national unification was not only achieved through enthusiasm and sacrifice, but also through money, debt, infrastructure, and international solvency. For Austria, these developments became increasingly threatening. The Habsburg monarchy lost influence in Italy and at the same time had to maintain its position in Germany against Prussia. The empire was large, but cumbersome. It had tradition, military experience, and diplomatic weight, but it struggled with internal nationality conflicts, administrative problems, and financial burdens. Prussia, on the other hand, increasingly developed into a militarily and administratively efficient state. The Prussian reforms, the expansion of the railways, the modernization of the army, and the political toughness of Otto von Bismarck created a new balance of power. Bismarck understood that national goals could not be achieved by speeches alone. He used diplomacy, limited wars, and political deception to expand Prussia's position step by step. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 between Prussia and Austria was short, but of enormous importance. He decided that Austria would be ousted from the German power system and that Prussia would take over the leadership in northern Germany. The Battle of Hrádek-Králové showed how much organization, rail transport, general staff work, and modern weapons had changed warfare. Prussia was able to mobilize more quickly, act in a more coordinated manner, and use its military reforms effectively. But this war was not only a military event. It was important in terms of fiscal policy because it strengthened Prussia's creditworthiness and political weight, while Austria had to come to terms with its defeat politically and economically. After 1866, it was clear that the German question would no longer be solved by the old German Confederation. It would be decided under Prussian leadership. Bond markets did not only react to such changes after the fact. They accompanied her. Investors observed which state appeared more stable, militarily successful, and administratively more efficient. A victory could strengthen confidence. A defeat could increase credit costs. But the markets were not omniscient. They could be wrong, overreact, or misjudge political risks. Banking houses like the Rothschilds tried to understand such developments early on. They observed governments, ministers, military preparations, and diplomatic tensions. Their task was not just to lend money, but to assess risks in an accelerating political world. The climax of this national war epoch was the Franco-German War from 1870 to 1871, when Bismarck took advantage of the crisis over the Spanish succession to the throne and the outrage in France to bring about a war in which the southern German states would side with Prussia. Napoleon III, whose rule was battered domestically, sought prestige and security, but underestimated the military strength of Prussia and its allies. The war was catastrophic for France. The defeat at Sedan in September 1870 led to the capture of the emperor and the fall of the Second Empire. But the war did not end immediately. Paris was besieged, a republic was proclaimed, and France finally had to accept harsh peace terms. In January 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. A new nation-state had emerged, and the European balance shifted fundamentally. Here, too, money was a crucial part of the story. After the Treaty of Frankfurt, France had to pay enormous war compensation. The speed with which France was able to raise this sum through bonds and national capital mobilization surprised many observers. It showed that France had considerable economic and financial strength despite military defeat. At the same time, the compensation meant a huge influx of capital for Germany, which influenced the economic development of the new Reich, but also encouraged speculative overheating. The war from 1870 to 1871 was thus not only a military and national turning point, but also a turning point in financial history. For the Rothschilds, this world had become more complicated than that of their early days. Nation-states became stronger, public financial markets broader, new banks and competitors emerged, and state institutions developed their own capacities. The family remained significant, but it was no longer as unique as it had been in the first half of the century. Financial capitalism became bigger, more diverse, and more anonymous. Stock corporations, railroad financing, industrial bonds, and international capital flows created new forms of economic power. The name Rothschild retained prestige, but the world in which it operated had changed. The connection between railways, war, and credit was particularly important. Railways were not only used for trade, but also for military mobilization. Troops could be brought to the limits more quickly, supplies distributed more efficiently, and entire operational plans could be designed according to schedules. The construction of railways required enormous amounts of capital, often raised through bonds and banking consortia. Those who financed railways thus financed not only economic progress, but also indirectly state power. In Italy, Germany, Austria, France, and Russia, infrastructure became part of the strategic competition. Modern nations were created not only by flags and anthems, but by rails, loans, barracks, schools, and tax administrations. This development raises moral questions again. When banks gave money to states, they helped to expand infrastructure, administration, and economic development. But these same structures could make wars more effective. A railway could transport grain, but also soldiers. A bond could finance reforms, but also cannons. A loan could create stability, but also enable military adventures. The Rothschilds and other financial houses constantly moved in this dichotomy. They were part of progress and part of power politics. They promoted trade, industrialization, and state modernization, but they also benefited from the needs of warring states. The wars of nations therefore showed that the modern state was increasingly becoming a financial machine. He needed taxes, debt, banks, industry, railways, and public approval. Nationalism helped to mobilize victims, but money had to organize these victims. Ideology could inspire people, but loans paid for rifles, uniforms, and railways. Military strength arose from the combination of population, administration, technology, and capital. It was precisely this connection that shaped the later 19th century and prepared the world in which the wars of the 20th century were to become even more comprehensive and destructive. At the end of this chapter, there is a sober realization. The Rothschilds did not direct these national wars from the shadows, but they lived and worked in a system in which wars were hardly conceivable without financial markets. The decisions were made by monarchs, ministers, parliaments, generals, and national movements. But their decisions had to be paid for. Bonds became bridges between political will and military reality. Whoever built these bridges was close to power. Not as an all-powerful ruler, but as an indispensable mediator of an epoch in which nations were born, borders shifted and money spoke the quiet language behind the loud cannons. Chapter 14. From Bank to Legend. In the course of the 19th century, the name Rothschild became more and more of a symbol. Initially, he had stood for a specific family business, for a bank with roots in Frankfurt, with brothers in London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, and Frankfurt, with experience in the coin trade, in the exchange business, in government bonds, and in the financing of major political tasks. But the more successful the family became, the more their name detached itself from the sober world of accounts, contracts, and bonds, and became a projection surface. For some, Rothschild was a sign of reliability, creditworthiness, and international financial strength. For others, the name became the symbol of a modern money power that was difficult to see and even harder to understand. It was precisely at this point that the transition from a real bank to a historical legend began. This change had a lot to do with time itself. Europe was changing faster than many people could comprehend. Railways connected cities. Factories changed working environments, new joint stock companies emerged, states became more indebted, newspapers spread news faster than before, and the political public sphere gained in importance. Power was no longer to be found only where a king resided or a general gathered his troops. Power also lay in stock market prices, credit decisions, investments, railway lines, bond markets, and international payment routes. This new power was abstract. You couldn't see it like a fortress. You couldn't count them like an army. Its effect was felt, but its mechanisms remained hidden from many. The Rothschilds stood for this new world like hardly any other family. Their houses were present in several European capitals. Their representatives associated with ministers, monarchs, diplomats, and entrepreneurs. Their decisions could inspire trust or cause doubt, and their name carried weight in the markets. If a state was able to place a bond through the House of Rothschild, this was often seen as a sign of stability. If the family hesitated, this could be understood as a warning signal. Their power was not based on formal rule, but on reputation. That was something new and irritating for many contemporaries. A king had a crown. One general had a uniform. A banker had confidence. But this trust could move millions. It was precisely this invisible form of power that generated admiration and mistrust at the same time. In political circles, it was known that large financial institutions were useful. They could help states to settle debts, finance wars, build railways, and process international payments. In public, however, a different image often emerged. There you could see the palaces of the family, their social advancement, their proximity to rulers, and their enormous wealth. They saw less the risks behind them, the possible losses, the dependence on political stability, the competition from other banks, and the limits of their power to act. From a distance, the family seemed more powerful, more cohesive, and more mysterious than they actually were. At the same time, the banking world itself changed. In the first half of the 19th century, family-run banks such as the Rothschilds had a particularly strong position. Trust was based on personal name, kinship, discretion, and long-standing relationships with governments. But in the second half of the century, new forms of finance became more prominent. Joint stock banks, industrial capital, large insurance companies, railway companies, and national financial institutions expanded the market. Capital was organized more broadly. More and more investors are participating in bonds, equities, and industrial projects. The Rothschilds remained significant, but they were no longer alone on an almost unique level. The modern world of finance has become larger, more confusing, and more anonymous. Nevertheless, their symbolic rank has been maintained. The name Rothschild had long been more than a company name. He had become a cipher. Anyone who talked about the power of money sooner or later talked about Rothschild. Those who criticized the influence of bankers named Rothschild. Anyone who wanted to explain the connection between war and credit could hardly get past Rothschild. But it was precisely this symbolic power that was dangerous. It could help to make historical contexts visible, but it could also lead to a single family being held responsible for entire structures. The Rothschilds were powerful, but they were not the financial world itself. They benefited from public debt, railroad construction, and international capital flows, but they did not create these developments alone. They were actors in an era, not its secret creators. This is particularly evident in the wars of the 19th century. The family was able to broker government bonds, organize payments, and influence markets through their trust. But wars arose from political interests, national movements, imperial rivalries, dynastic decisions, military planning, and social tensions. Italian unification was not invented by bankers, but arose from the interplay of the national movement, Piedmontese statecraft, French power politics, and Austrian weakness. German unification was not decided at a bank table, but through Prussian strategy, Bismarck's diplomacy, military reforms, and the national political situation in Europe. The Crimean War arose from the struggle for the Ottoman Empire, Russians striving for influence, and British-French counterpolitics. Financial institutions could accompany and enable such conflicts, but they were not their deepest cause. Nevertheless, they had responsibility. It would also be wrong to regard the Rothschilds as mere service providers with no political effect. Those who provide states with credit help them to act. Anyone who gives a government confidence in the capital market makes it easier for it to maneuver. Anyone who finances railways, mines, or government bonds helps shape economic and political developments. The power of the Rothschilds lay precisely in this intermediate position. They were not rulers, but they were not uninvolved spectators either. They stood between the state and the market, between public policy and private capital, between the costs of war and investor interests. This intermediate position made them influential and vulnerable at the same time. As the family's wealth grew, so did their social advancement. The Rothschilds were ennobled, bought estates, built magnificent houses, collected art, promoted charitable projects, and moved in the upper circles of Europe. This rise was historically remarkable because it began from a world in which Jewish families had been severely restricted by law. In just a few generations, a family from Frankfurt's Judengasse had become a dynasty that associated with kings, emperors, and ministers. But it was precisely this rise that aroused envy and hostility. For many representatives of the old elites, it was hard to bear that a Jewish banking family gained a position through money and skill that had previously been almost exclusively reserved for the nobility and land ownership. Here, social fear was combined with anti-Semitic prejudice. Old enemy images were translated into new political language. The modern anti-Semitism of the 19th century was not only religious, but increasingly political, economic, and national. Jewish people were no longer attacked solely because of their faith, but were portrayed as an allegedly alien force within the nation. The Rothschilds were particularly suited to such enemy images because they were rich, international, Jewish, and visible. Their European networks turned into alleged rootlessness in hostile narratives. Their discretion turned into alleged secrecy. Their financial competence turned into alleged manipulation. Their success turned into alleged guilt. Such ideas were disseminated in caricatures, pamphlets, newspapers, and political speeches. The figure of the banker was often portrayed in a distorted way, as greedy, cold, boundless, and secretly ruling. In the process, justified social criticism and dangerous hatred were mixed. It was perfectly legitimate to discuss the power of large financial institutions. It was legitimate to ask whether private bankers had too much influence over states, whether wars were prolonged by credit, and whether profits from government debt were morally problematic. But anti-Semitic depictions did not make it a structural criticism, but an image of the enemy. It was not the system that was analyzed, but a Jewish family that was made a symbol of evil. The legend of the all-powerful Rothschild family has been renewed again and again. It was so long-lasting because it gave simple answers to difficult questions. Why do states get into debt? Because bankers supposedly make them do it. Why do wars break out? Because supposedly financial powers make money from it. Why do societies change? Because secret networks are supposedly working in the background. Such answers are convenient, but wrong. They replace history with suspicion. They take responsibility away from the actual actors, the governments, militaries, parties, monarchs, parliaments and societies that prepared, supported, or accepted wars. A conspiracy narrative has a critical effect, but it often makes real power invisible because it reduces it to an invented secret control. The real influence of the Rothschilds was more sober and therefore more historically interesting. They understood earlier than many others that modern states were dependent on credit. They built a network that connected information, capital, and trust. They acted cautiously but decisively. They benefited from wars, but also from peace. They financed governments, but they themselves had to constantly consider political risks. They were powerful, but vulnerable. They could influence markets, but they could not dominate them at will. They could support governments, but they could not stop the deep forces of nationalism, revolution, industrialization, and imperial competition. It is precisely their limitations that show that the history of the Rothschilds must not be told as a story of secret omnipotence. In the late 19th century, nation-states became stronger. Governments developed their own financial administrations, central banks gained in importance, new banks appeared, and large industrial companies collected enormous capital. The world of the Rothschild family remained influential, but it became part of a broader system. Modern financial power was no longer concentrated in a single family. It was distributed among markets, institutions, states, and companies. The myth, however, often remained with the old personalization, because a family was easier to imagine than a complex system. This makes the Rothschild legend effective to this day. In times of crisis, people look for names, faces, and culprits. Abstract structures are difficult to grasp. One name, on the other hand, can be told. The name Rothschild has therefore been used again and again to talk about money, war, globalization, banks, and political power, often without knowing the actual history. But if you take history seriously, you have to take a closer look. He must recognize the performance of the family without exaggerating it. He must analyze their power without falling into conspiracy thinking. He must ask the moral questions of war financing without repeating anti-Semitic patterns. So there is a double path from bank to legend. The first path is real ascent, from a Frankfurt trading house to a European financial network, from coins and bills of exchange to government bonds and major projects, from local limits to international presence. The second path is the path of narrative, from admiration to mistrust, from distrust to rumor, from rumor to myth. Both paths are part of the history of the Rothschilds. But they must not be confused. The real family acted in a world of risk, calculation, political relations, and economic change. Legend, on the other hand, made her a symbol of fears that went far beyond her. At the end of the 19th century, the name Rothschild was therefore on a strange threshold. It was a sign of success, wealth, and European financial power, but also a magnet for prejudice. He recalled a time when private banks helped kings and states finance war and peace. At the same time, he referred to the coming world, in which capital was to become even bigger, more anonymous, and more global. The Rothschilds had not created this world alone, but they had made its emergence visible like hardly any other family. This is precisely where their historical significance lies. They show how money became the language of power, how financial trust underpinned political orders, and how real influence could give rise to a legend that often reveals more about society's fears than about the family itself. Chapter 15. Heritage, Memory, and Responsibility. At the end of the story about the Rothschild family, the wars of Europe and the power of money, there is no easy judgment. This is precisely what makes this topic so important. It would be convenient to either celebrate the Rothschilds as pure geniuses of finance or portray them as the dark force behind Europe's wars. Both would be too easy. The historical reality is more complicated, more humane, and more instructive. The Rothschilds were not all-powerful rulers of world history, but they were not incidental spectators either. They stood at a crucial interface of modern Europe, between state and capital, between war and credit, between political trust and economic risk. Their story shows how much power changed in the 19th century and how difficult it is to talk honestly about money, war, and influence to this day. The family began in a world of restrictions. Frankfurt's Judengasse was not a place of privileged power, but a space of legal limitation, social exclusion, and harsh living conditions. The fact that one of Europe's best-known banking dynasties emerged from this environment is one of the most remarkable stories of rise in modern history. Mayor Amschel Rothschild and his sons took advantage of opportunities that arose from trade, the coin business, bills of exchange, state financing, and international contacts. They built a family network that had enormous advantages in an era of slow news and unsafe traffic routes. Their strength lay not in military force, but in trust, speed, discretion, and the ability to translate political risks into financial decisions. But this rise came at a time when Europe was shaken by wars. The French Revolution, the Wars of the Coalition, Napoleon's rule, the Continental Blockade, Waterloo, and the reorganization after 1815 formed the historical space in which the Rothschilds rose to great importance. States need money, and on an unprecedented scale. Armies had to be fed, soldiers paid, allies supported, gold moved, and debt serviced. Modern war was not only a question of courage, strategy, and cannons, but also a question of creditworthiness. Those who could pay could fight longer. Those who received credit could keep alliances. Those who lost trust lost political action. In this world, bankers became actors of historical importance. Precisely for this reason, the moral question cannot be avoided. Anyone who finances war or secures the solvency of warring states is not outside of power. Even if bankers do not draw up battle plans, give orders to attack, and send soldiers into the fire, their business helps states to act. The Rothschilds earned money from government finances, bonds, payment services, and the ability to provide solutions in times of crisis. This was legal, often admired, and necessary from the point of view of the governments. But it was not morally neutral. Any history of war financing must withstand this tension. Money can secure order, but it can also prolong war. Credit can stabilize states, but it can also enable power politics. Financial literacy can create wealth, but it can also make violence indirectly sustainable. At the same time, it would be wrong to transfer responsibility for Europe's wars to a banking family. The causes of the major conflicts lay in political decisions, dynastic interests, revolutionary ideologies, national movements, imperial rivalries, military planning, and social tensions. Napoleon did not wage his wars because a banking house forced him to do so. Prussia, Austria, France, Great Britain, and Russia acted out of their own power interests. Italian and German unification did not arise from a secret financial plan, but from nationalism, statesmanship, military reform, and diplomatic opportunity. Banks could accompany, enable, or benefit from such processes, but they did not replace the political actors who made decisions. This is precisely one of the most important lessons of this topic. It is necessary to analyze power structures, but dangerous to turn complex history into conspiracy narratives. The Rothschilds had real influence. They were major financial players, they moved large sums of money, they were associated with governments, and their name could inspire confidence in markets. But influence was turned into omnipotence in many stories. Discretion turned into alleged secrecy. International networking turned into alleged disloyalty. Financial success became an enemy. This transformation is not harmless. It is part of the history of modern anti-Semitism. The Rothschild family was repeatedly criticized not only as a rich family, but demonized as a Jewish family. Their success was framed in old prejudices that Jewish people associated with money, deception, and secret power. This steered real questions about national debt, banks, war, and capital in a dangerous direction. Instead of investigating structures, guilty parties were invented. Instead of analyzing political decisions, minorities were suspected. Instead of looking at the responsibility of governments, militaries, and societies, a family was turned into a projection screen. This mechanism is still recognizable today when complex crises are explained by alleged secret masterminds. That is why remembrance in this history is also responsibility. Anyone who talks about the Rothschilds is not just talking about banks. He talks about the power of narratives. A false story can be more durable than a correct archival document. The legend of Waterloo shows this clearly. The idea that Nathan Mayer Rothschild manipulated the market through a secret message and made a huge fortune from the battle is historically untenable in this dramatic form. Nevertheless, it remained effective because it was memorable. It combined war, money, secret knowledge, and mistrust into an image that was easy to retell. Such images often shape the memory more strongly than sober analysis. That is why history needs accuracy, patience, and the willingness to question simple answers. But the legacy of the Rothschilds does not only lie in the myths that have arisen about them. It also lies in the real development of modern finance. The family showed how important international networks, reputation, and speed of information became. It helped shape a world in which government bonds, capital markets, and private banks became central components of political power. The state of the 19th century was no longer just a court, an army, and an administration. He was also a debtor in a market. His strength depended on whether investors trusted him, whether banks placed his bonds, whether tax revenues were stable, and whether political order appeared credible. This connection between state and capital still shapes the world today. Modern states continue to finance themselves through debt. Financial markets continue to react to political crises, wars, changes of government, and economic uncertainty. Even today, it is clear that power lies not only in parliaments, presidential palaces, or military headquarters, but also in interest rates, creditworthiness, currencies, supply chains, and investor confidence. The difference is that the financial world today has become even bigger, faster, and more anonymous. Where in the 19th century a family network sent messages with couriers, today information moves around the world in seconds. But the basic principle remains similar: trust is power. Those who bundle trust steer possible courses of action. This is precisely why the Rothschild story is so topical. It shows that financial power must be taken seriously without mystically exaggerating it. You have to ask who profits from wars, who gives credit to states, who bears the risks, and who pays the costs in the end. You have to examine how private interests influence public decisions. You have to understand that money opens or closes political leeway. But you have to be precise. Serious criticism of financial power does not need conspiracy narratives. On the contrary, it is weakened by such narratives because they distract from the real mechanisms. The history of the Rothschilds is also a history of social ambivalence. Europe needed Jewish bankers, merchants, scientists, doctors, entrepreneurs, and intellectuals, but it denied Jewish people equal rights and full recognition for a long time. The success of the Rothschilds was therefore always ambiguous. He proved what was possible despite exclusion, but he did not protect against hatred. He gained access to courts and governments, but he also made the family visible to envy and enmity. He showed the opening of the modern world, but also its continuing prejudices. In this tension lies a human core of the story. Behind the big name were people who acted, planned, feared, risked, and had to assert themselves in a society that did not always accept their success. If you look at the family's 5 houses, you can also see the boundaries of each dynasty. Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples once formed a unique network, but no network remains the same forever. Political upheavals, new states, new banks, industrialization, nationalism, and later the catastrophes of the 20th century changed the world. The Rothschilds remained important, but financial power was increasingly distributed among institutions, markets, and companies. The era of the big family bankers has become a world of central banks, stock banks, multinational corporations, and global capital flows. The myth often lasted longer than the historical special position. Thus, this story does not end with a final judgment, but with an insight. The Rothschilds were a mirror of their era. They bundled the major themes of modern Europe: war and credit, Jewish emancipation and anti-Semitic hatred, family strategy and the global market, state power and private capital, real financial power and dangerous legend-making. Anyone who tells their story, therefore, tells more than the story of a family. He tells how Europe learned to fight wars not only with blood and iron, but also with debt and trust. He tells how peace had to be financed after the battles. And he tells how easily societies tend to transform complicated power relations into simple enemy images. The responsibility is to see both at the same time, the real influence and the limits of this influence. The Rothschilds were powerful, but not omnipotent. They were profiteers of a warlike and indebted world of states, but not its secret inventors. They were part of the history of European power, but also the target of prejudices. They moved money, but they did not only move history. This distinction is crucial, because it is the only way to learn from the past. In the end, the question remains with which this script began. Do money and banks influence wars more than kings, generals, and ideologies? The answer is not simply yes or no. Money alone does not decide why people fight. But without money, states can hardly stick to their decisions. Ideologies ignite conflicts, generals lead armies, politicians set goals, societies bear burdens. But credit, taxes, bonds, and solvency determine how long and how far these goals can be pursued. The history of the Rothschilds makes this invisible part of power visible. And that is precisely why it is so important. It reminds us that behind every major war there are not only battlefields, but also bills, contracts, debts, and people who decide who they trust.